Chapter 1950. The world of laws was derived from the dermic power of laws, and the dermic power of laws was derived from Luo Fan's most fundamental worldview of laws. In this way, it was obvious that these world of laws were constructed completely according to Luo Fan's worldview of laws. Moreover, unlike all the world of laws constructed in the past, these world of laws contained the will of heaven and earth. This kind of will of heaven and earth was naturally incomparable to the true will of heaven and earth. However, it had already fused all of Luo Fan's understanding of the will of the heavens and earth into it. With Luo Fan's deeper and deeper understanding of the will of the heavens and earth, these wills of the heavens and earth already had traces of the might of the will of the heavens and earth. In this way, the power of these world of laws was tens of thousands of times stronger than the power of the world of laws that originally did not have the will of heaven and earth. Moreover, because of the existence of the will of heaven and earth, these world of laws contained all kinds of abilities that they originally did not have. For example, they could fuse with each other, derive from each other, and replace each other with these special abilities. The damage that the countless world of laws derived from the dermic power of laws caused to the chaotic thundercloud continued to increase. From time to time, the chaotic thundercloud would be completely devoured by the world of laws and eventually transformed into the power of the world of laws, causing the power of the world of laws to become even stronger. During this process, the various world of laws began to continuously connect and combine together. The power of the world of laws communicated with each other and flowed continuously. As this flowed, a cycle gradually formed and began to push the power of those world of laws upwards, causing the level of the cultivators in those world of laws to continuously increase. This change was naturally a joyous event for Luo Fan. However, for the chaotic thundercloud, obviously, it was a kind of misfortune. As time passed, the chaotic thundercloud was gradually enveloped by the world of laws, causing the battlefield above the chaotic thundercloud to gradually appear. It gradually transformed into the appearance of the world of laws. The world of laws on the surface began to gradually fuse into one. In just a few days, it had completely turned into an incomparably complete world, a sealed world. When the last bit of the change was completed, none of the living beings in the chaos world could see the chaotic lightning cloud anymore. In the eyes of all living beings, apart from the world of laws hidden in the fog, there was nothing else in the sky. The chaotic lightning cloud had already turned into a cloud inside the world of laws. It had become a mutation inside the world of laws. As the creator of countless worlds of laws, all the changes within those worlds of laws were completely under Luo Fan's control. At this moment, his consciousness descended into the huge world of laws. He saw with his own eyes the incomparably tragic war that was erupting within that world. Although it seemed like only a few days had passed in the untainted world, in fact, it had been billions of trillions of years for the entire world of laws and the entire chaotic thundercloud. Currently, the cultivation civilization in the world of laws had already flourished to a level that was close to its peak. Moreover, because Luo Fan's understanding and mastery of the world had become deeper and deeper, the cultivators in the world of laws cultivated in it were no longer ordinary cultivation methods. However, it wasn't any ordinary cultivation method, but a cultivation system of nomological powers. In this cultivation system, any cultivator cultivated it. They were all incomparably powerful Dharma power of laws. It went without saying that the strength of such an infinite number of living beings gathered together was strong. In the fierce battle against the chaotic lightning clouds, the cultivation civilization in the world of laws was winning again and again. They were constantly breaking, weakening, and dissolving the chaotic lightning in the chaotic lightning clouds with incomparable smoothness. They turned into resources for the cultivators to improve, materials for refining weapons and alchemy, and necessities for setting up formations. The chaotic thundercloud gave birth to endless changes, triggering countless attacks that exceeded the limits of the imagination of living beings. Every bit of power and the power of each bit of lightning was stimulated to a terrifying effect that was tens of thousands of times stronger than itself. However, no matter how hard the chaotic thundercloud tried and what changes it gave birth to, it could only obtain a temporary advantage and victory at most. In the end, the numerous cultivators would inevitably study its weakness and find a way to deal with it. In the end, they would win the battle. In this way, it was unknown how many billions of trillions of years had passed in the world of laws. And the chaotic thundercloud in the center of the world had also been reduced to less than 1/10 of its original size by the countless living beings over this incomparably long period of time, although it was still extremely terrifying in terms of quantity and contained endless power. It was still at a complete disadvantage in the face of the countless cultivators and experts in the entire world of laws. Because this absolute disadvantage had created a result that made people not know whether to laugh or cry. That was, the chaotic thundercloud had been completely regarded as a kind of cultivation resource by the cultivators in the world of laws. It could be said that if it wasn't for the will of heaven and earth controlling the overall situation, the chaotic thundercloud might have already been treated as a non-renewable resource by the many cultivators in the world of laws over such a long period of time. How could it be like now, treating him as a mortal enemy and engaging in an incomparably tragic battle? At this time, Luo Fan's mind was behind the world will of the countless world of laws. He was controlling all the world will of the laws and the macro changes of the world of laws from a higher level. All the changes that had occurred in the world of laws over the past billions of trillion years had been born under his control. Every time the cultivation world underwent a fundamental transformation, a leap in advancement and transformation, it was also mostly because of him. It could be said that if it wasn't for his help, it would have been impossible for the chaotic lightning cloud to be forced to such a state so smoothly. There would definitely have been more repeated occurrences in the past billions of trillion years. On this day, Luo Fan, who was on the mysterious plane, had a thought. He felt an indescribable terror being born from the chaotic lightning clouds in the center of the world. This kind of terror was so intense that it was indescribable. It felt as if a perfect world had completely exploded in front of him. Faced with such a feeling, Luo Fan instantly understood. This must be the last resort of the chaotic lightning cloud. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't hesitate to control the countless world wills and began to frantically gather the power of the countless world of laws, pouring it into the chaotic lightning cloud in the center of the world. Luo Fan's reaction couldn't be said to be slow. In the end, he had only taken this action after he had reacted. Compared to the direct transformation of the chaotic lightning cloud, it was still a little slow. At this moment, the primal chaos lightning cloud suddenly exploded. An infinite powerful impact beyond the imagination of all living beings was released from it. It began to destroy all space-time, all power, all defenses, all arrays, and even all magic treasures that it came into contact with. They were all completely destroyed. Immediately afterward, this power spread in all directions at an even faster speed, destroying more and more areas in the surroundings. In the blink of an eye, it had shaken the foundation of the entire world of laws, causing the entire world of laws to tremble violently. At this time, even though this world had developed for an unknown number of trillions of years, and the cultivation civilization had become so powerful that it even had the power to surpass this world and step into a broader world. But it still couldn't stop this world from heading towards destruction and extinction. Time no longer had any meaning at this time. It felt like, at the same time, the entire world had developed to its worst state. All the laws were completely broken, and the world will collapsed and died at the same time. At the same time, it collapsed and died. All living beings in that world were devoured by the destruction in batches and disappeared without a trace. Even the living beings that were comparable to the supreme monarchs in this world could not resist this destruction. They were completely erased from their roots. Due to the acceleration of time in this world of laws, although only a few days had passed in the outside world, it was unknown how many trillions of years had passed in this world. With such a long time, the endless world, and the endless living beings, it was simply natural for some supreme emperor-level cultivators to be nurtured. However, after all, it was only based on Luo Fan's world of laws. Although they were already supreme emperors, they were still restricted by this world because of their close connection with it. They were affected by the will of heaven and earth, and they couldn't be like the supreme emperors born in a perfect world. They couldn't easily transcend the world, transcend heaven and earth, and step into a broader and more profound level. They could only be limited to the inside of this world of laws. If they wanted to transcend, they would have to completely release the restrictions of this world, and the chaotic lightning cloud wouldn't target them at all, but obviously, both of these were impossible. The fundamental reason for the appearance of this world of laws was to deal with the chaotic lightning cloud. If they lost them, wouldn't the power of this world be greatly reduced? Not to mention destroying the primal chaos lightning cloud, it would be extremely unlikely for him to remain unscathed within the primal chaos lightning cloud. Therefore, it was obviously impossible for the world of laws to completely release the restrictions on these supreme emperors and allow them to transcend themselves and leave this place completely. As for the chaotic lightning cloud, there was no need to mention it. For it, everything related to the world of laws, be it the world itself, everything born in it, all living beings, and all cultivators, were its enemies. They were all existences that wouldn't rest until one of them was dead. Under such circumstances, how could it give up its attack on these supreme emperors? How could it just let these supreme emperors transcend, gain complete freedom, and step into a higher level? Even if it used the most rational thinking to weigh the pros and cons, such a thing would never happen. After all, even if the chaotic lightning cloud could predict that the power it had to deal with would be greatly weakened after the supreme emperors transcended their own world. However, since it could predict this rationally, how could it not predict the future development? If these supreme emperors were released, their speed of improvement would definitely be much faster than it was now. Perhaps not long after, they would be able to obtain stronger cultivation and more terrifying power. Then, they would be able to obtain even stronger cultivation and even more terrifying power. At that time, if one or two of them suddenly felt grateful to the world they were born into, if it returned to help this world, wouldn't it be looking for an opponent for itself? Putting everything else aside, wasn't the current Luo Fan the most typical representative of this? The power he cultivated initially came from the primordial world. Later on, because of various opportunities, he transcended and stepped into a higher level. But now, wasn't it because he was grateful for everything that the primordial world had given him that he returned to help the primordial world grow and transcend the third great tribulation of the world? Because of this, those supreme emperors could only be destroyed along with the destruction of the world of laws. What a pity! Along with Luo Fan's sigh, all the laws in the surroundings completely disappeared and were replaced by something else. It was at the boundary of the primordial world, in a place that seemed to be the primordial world, but also seemed to be outside the primordial world. And in front of him, a lightning figure that was 1,000 feet tall stood there quietly. It was none other than the product formed by the remnant of the chaotic lightning cloud after it abandoned most of the chaotic lightning. Although it was many times weaker than the primal chaos lightning cloud, it was much weaker than the primal chaos lightning cloud. However, correspondingly, its intelligence, its spiritual sense was much stronger than before. In fact, it had already abandoned most of its power. Although it was much weaker than before. However, compared to Luo Fan himself, it was not much weaker. It felt like it was even stronger than before. The lightning figure's body shook, and the lightning around its body converged. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a battle armor that covered its body. Its face. It had already been revealed. This figure was quite familiar to Luo Fan, but it was not him. Instead, it was a burly man. A burly man whose body and face looked extremely perfect, as if it contained the two absolute concepts of power and perfection. The reason why he found this burly man familiar was that this burly man had the figure and appearance of Pangu that he had obtained from Pangu's primordial spirit. Pangu. The burly man opened his mouth and spat out these two words. This voice turned into an endless roar that instantly rushed towards Luo Fan's mind. Even though Luo Fan was already prepared, this roar still broke through his mind, causing his mind, which was in between the primordial world and the primordial world, to completely collapse at this moment. This naturally did not mean that Luo Fan's strength was much weaker than that of this burly man. Instead, it was too difficult for his mind to directly face the complete burly man at this moment. However, compared to the collapse of his mind, Luo Fan was even more shocked at this moment. This is Pangu? This was the only thought in his mind, which had just regained focus. With this thought, how could he still remain unmoving in the cluster of worlds? He rushed out of the cluster of worlds, and with another stride, he had already crossed the endless space-time and arrived at the original location of his mind. At this moment, he saw with his own eyes the 1,000-meter-tall burly man not far away from him. This burly man stood there with empty eyes. His whole body exuded an absolute strength. Every rise and fall of his body, every line, and even the distribution of each strand of hair contained an endless truth. It contained a profound principle that was enough to completely crush everything that Luo Fan had comprehended since he had stepped onto the path of cultivation. This is not the real Pangu. Seeing this, Luo Fan's heart was burning, and he relaxed. This judgment was not baseless confidence, but it was based on his own understanding of the true divine. Although the figure in front of him, who called himself Pangu and looked extremely similar to Pangu, was extremely powerful, it was still many times weaker than a true saint. To be able to create a complete and perfect world, it was obvious that only a true divine stage existence could exist. In other words, Pangu himself was definitely a true saint. In this case, the burly man in front of him was not a true saint, and naturally could not be the real Pangu. In fact, compared to the projection of a true saint that Luo Fan had encountered during the Third Tribulation, this burly man was far inferior. Obviously, it was not even the projection of a true saint. After discovering this, he naturally calmed down. Die. The burly man spat at this moment. This sentence also rushed towards Luo Fan like rolling thunder, directly tearing apart and destroying the space-time around him, the rules and laws around him, and even everything else. However, it was not Luo Fan's mind that was casually condensed, but his real body that was here. Facing the terrifying impact caused by this shout, he actually. Chapter 1951. At this moment, the burly man had already delivered his fist to Luo Fan. There was no sound, no fluctuation of power, and no change of light or shadow. It was like an ordinary punch thrown by an ordinary person. However, in the face of this punch, Luo Fan's heart could not help but race. A strong premonition of danger urged him to react. What kind of technique is this? At this moment, this thought flashed across his mind. With this thought, he did not hesitate to condense all the power he could, including the power of the spiritual treasure embryo, his own Dharma power of laws, and all the support he could obtain in the untainted world. He compressed them into his fist, and threw a punch at the burly man's fist. Compared to the burly man's silent and ordinary punch, the momentum of Luo Fan's punch was earth-shattering. As soon as it was thrown, countless spacetimes, worlds and worlds were born and destroyed. Even the entire untainted world seemed to be slightly shaken by this punch. The momentum of such a punch was so earth-shattering that no one could describe it with words. For a moment, all the living creatures in the entire untainted world seemed to have seen the Big Bang of the universe. Even their intelligence suddenly went blank for a moment. They could not even remember the horror of this moment. It was as if this horrifying scene could completely destroy their souls and erase their lives if it remained in their memories for another moment. Luo Fan's fist violently collided with the burly man's fist. In terms of power alone, the power contained in Luo Fan's punch was tens of thousands of times stronger than that of the burly man's punch. However, such a powerful force was swiftly destroyed by the opponent's seemingly ordinary punch. The power of the spiritual treasure embryo. It was completely shattered at the first moment. All the attacks completely dissipated. It looked like countless specks of light had been blasted out by this punch. The light spots splashed in all directions, as if a new starry sky had been created in the sky of the untainted world. What collapsed next was Luo Fan's nomological powers, his physical strength, and even his attack power on the conceptual level. The dissipation of this power was even more shocking than the destruction of the spirit treasure embryo. The starry sky that had just formed collapsed in an instant. It was completely wiped out, as if an invisible hand had forcefully pressed down on everything that was glowing and extinguished it. In the end, only the support that the primordial world gave him, which was much weaker than the two, did not change at all in the face of the burly man's punch. However, he easily blocked the punch from the burly man. In the end, Luo Fan's fist, which was several dozen feet in size, was forcibly blocked not far from the front of the burly man's body. At this moment, the expression of the man who called himself Pan Gu abruptly changed in an extremely complicated manner. He seemed to be surprised. It also seemed to be in disbelief, and there was even an extremely deep pain. The look in his eyes instantly became turbulent. It was as if countless pieces of information and memories were crazily bursting out from his mind. At this moment, the aura on his body began to rise at an unimaginable speed. The invisible obstacles were like pieces of paper in front of this rise. They could only occasionally make the rise pause. It seemed like billions of years had passed, but it also seemed like less than a breath had passed. All the changes in the burly man's expression had completely calmed down. There was no longer any emptiness in his eyes, nor was there a trace of confusion. "So that's how it is." These 4 words came out of his mouth. The moment he heard these 4 words, Luo Fan's body trembled. In a trance, he felt endless information enter his heart through these 4 words. Although this information was unimaginably complicated, it had an extremely strong sense of order. This allowed Luo Fan to sort out the endless information without much effort. He knew what this information was trying to express. This information was clearly explaining the cause and effect of these 4 words. It allowed him to instantly understand the various emotions and thoughts of this burly man when he said these words, as well as the fundamental reason why he said these words, and so on and so forth. In the end, Luo Fan exclaimed in disbelief, "You're Pangu?" The burly man smiled and said, "Why? You have a trace of my primordial spirit in your body. Can't you recognize me?" This voice also contained endless information, and it was also instantly received by Luo Fan. Although this information was extremely orderly and he could easily sort it out, it was still an incomparably large amount of information. When such information flowed into his heart, the pressure it brought to his heart could not be completely eliminated. If it was not Luo Fan who was listening to these words, any other creature, any cultivator, when faced with such information, what awaited them would not be more than a few words before their minds would collapse and completely explode. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly understood. Even if this person in front of him was not a true saint, he should only be lacking a little bit of opportunity. If such an existence was not Pangu, he could not think of who else could it be. Thinking about this, Luo Fan sighed and immediately bowed, sincerely thanking Pangu for his kindness. For the real Pangu, it was not too much for Luo Fan to bow to him. After all, it was because Pangu opened up the primordial world and left behind Pangu's primordial spirit that made Luo Fan who he was today. This could be said to be the grace of a new life. The burly man smiled and said, "I have to thank you. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have been able to wake up. By then, I would have been controlled by this tribulation to destroy the world I opened up. That would have been sad. As he spoke, wisps of lightning began to spread out from Pangu's body. Unlike the lightning that dispersed from the chaotic lightning clouds, which would evolve into all sorts of strange creatures to wreak havoc, these lightning bolts gradually dissipated in the void and turned into nothingness. In just a few breaths' time, Pangu's figure had already become twice as blurry as before because of this. It's a pity that I can't use this to be reborn. Pangu looked at his body and sighed. With the help of the countless information contained in these words, Luo Fan suddenly understood many things. This Pangu in front of him was obviously an existence with the same nature as the phantom of a true saint that he had encountered during the third tribulation. When he woke up, when he regained his intelligence, it was equivalent to being free from the control of the tribulation. At the same time, it was equivalent to being free from the support of the power of the tribulation. Under such circumstances, the more mysterious mechanism of the chaotic state would naturally work on him again, causing him to return to the abyss of death and gradually dissipate. You're a true saint, why did you die? Seeing that Pangu was about to dissipate, Luo Fan hurriedly seized the time and asked the question that he was most concerned about. The reason why he tirelessly pursued to become a true saint at the risk of countless deaths was because a true saint was eternal and indestructible. It was because true saints were eternal and indestructible existences. Once they succeeded, they would be able to transcend all shackles and obtain true freedom and freedom. However, now he had encountered the traces and remnant projections of true saints after their deaths one after another. This was simply completely subverting his understanding of true saint. How could he not be concerned? The chaotic state is deeper than you think. True saint? That's just the beginning. At your level, eternal and indestructible existences, but at a higher level, they can be easily destroyed. It's just something that can be easily destroyed. Pangu laughed and said. This time, this sentence did not bring any information to Luo Fan's mind. It sounded like ordinary words said by an ordinary cultivator. Feeling this change, Luo Fan suddenly understood that Pangu was about to disappear. Sure enough, just as this thought flashed through his mind, Pangu in front of him had completely disappeared. It was as if he had never appeared. As he disappeared, endless golden light was produced from the chaotic state. It directly poured into the entire untainted world, causing the entire untainted world to grow continuously. Space became more and more stable. Time became more and more stable. The primordial chi became denser and denser. The nomological laws became more and more complicated. The mysteries of the Supreme Great Tao became more and more profound. The various traces of destruction caused by the great tribulation of heaven and earth began to recover at this moment. Boundless vitality was constantly being stimulated, fusing with everything in the world. This scene was a miracle to all living beings in this world. For a moment, all kinds of indescribable joy emerged in the hearts of the remaining living beings in this world. All of a sudden, all living beings knew that this terrifying tribulation had been overcome. At this moment, the face of the Alliance leader of the Orthodox Tao Alliance was covered in tears. He only muttered, "The Tao ancestor did not let me down. The Tao ancestor did not let me down." Behind him, the few higher-ups of the Orthodox Tao Alliance also had tears streaming down their faces. They could only feel endless complicated emotions surging from the bottom of their hearts. Among these complicated emotions, there were memories of their deceased comrades, yearning for a beautiful future, and even gratitude to the Tao ancestor. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was at the border of the world, felt even more complicated than all living beings. Compared to all living beings, he knew more information. All living beings only knew that the Tao ancestor had helped them eliminate the tribulation, but they did not know that the one who had truly eliminated the tribulation was not him, but Pangu. Recalling everything that had happened before, He had already understood that the reason why he had been able to resist Pangu's punch in the end was not because the primordial world's support for him was strong enough, but because Pangu had instinctively sensed the existence of this support. He had taken the initiative to break free from the control of the tribulation and restore his own intelligence. In other words, if he had not faced Pangu, he would not have been able to resist the other party's punch and would have been directly smashed to pieces. Even his concept of existence might have been greatly damaged. As for Pangu's subsequent dissipation, it was the result of the other party taking advantage of the situation. If he had not taken advantage of the situation, even if he had lost the support of the power of the tribulation, even if there was an extremely mysterious mechanism in the depths of the state of chaos, it would not have dissipated so easily. After all, that was a true saint. All of these combined could be said to be. The one who had truly helped the primordial world survive the great tribulation of heaven and earth was not him, but Pangu. In the end, I still don't have the right to be complacent. In the end, he could only sigh. After surviving the third tribulation, although he knew that he was still extremely far away from becoming a true saint. However, because many cultivators he had seen were below him, he had unknowingly developed a slight complacency. This complacency caused him to have the idea of training all living beings in the primordial world when he faced the third great tribulation of heaven and earth. He did not go all out to help the primordial world from the beginning. Fortunately, he had encountered Pangu this time. If it was the projection of a true saint who did not have a special feeling for the primordial world, he did not dare to imagine what the result would be. However, is the true saint just the beginning? Soon, his thoughts changed. The last sentence that Pangu had said previously appeared in his mind. The feeling that there was a long road ahead, and that there was no end to cultivation made him feel uncertain, but at the same time, a strong fighting spirit arose in him. All kinds of thoughts and ideas flashed in his mind. After a while, he regained his composure, turned around, and took a step forward. His figure had already stepped into the primordial world again. When he arrived here, he could feel that the entire primordial world was constantly expanding outward. He could feel it. Every area and everything in the untainted land was constantly attracting the endless golden light. Through the absorption of the golden light, they were able to grow fundamentally. When he turned his gaze outwards, he had already placed his gaze outside the primordial world. He saw the border between the primordial world and the state of chaos. There, the primordial world, which had been supported by the golden light, seemed to have transformed into a tautai. It crazily devoured the state of chaos in the outside world and continuously transformed the state of chaos into resources for its own growth. The power of growth. In the process of such changes, the border of the primordial world began to continuously push towards the depths of the state of chaos. Is this the essence of the great tribulation of heaven and earth? Luo Fan looked at this scene. This thought suddenly flashed across his mind. The perfect world had been tempered under the test of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. His own endurance had been expanded, and he had gained an advantage over the state of chaos that he had been unable to resist. Then he began to devour the state of chaos. When he had devoured enough state of chaos and his body had reached a balance with the state of chaos, the devouring stopped. The perfect world also stabilized again and began to brew, waiting for the next great tribulation of heaven and earth, waiting for the next devouring. Naturally, Luo Fan was very clear about the difference between this kind of understanding and the true essence of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It could be said that this kind of understanding, at most, involved a little bit of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, but that was only the essence. There might even be a huge mistake. However, to be able to obtain this kind of understanding also represented his knowledge, and his senses had been greatly improved compared to before. The process of the world devouring the state of chaos contained endless mysteries. Even the mysteries of true sages seemed insignificant in comparison. At first, Luo Fan didn't have any intention of sensing this process with his heart, but when he looked at it, he was shocked by the profoundness of it. Unknowingly, he had already fallen into a state of sensing it. The entire process was constantly flowing in his heart. Every detail and every change was cycled in his heart. The profoundness contained in it was constantly being extracted and decomposed by him, gradually turning into various expressions that he could understand. It was either integrated into his worldview of laws, or it was constantly adjusting his understanding of the worldview of laws. In front of such a person, time was completely meaningless. After an unknown period of time, the devouring suddenly stopped. At least, he could sense that it had stopped. As the devouring stopped, Luo Fan suddenly woke up from the process of perception, and his perception of time appeared once again. It's already been 1,000,000 years. When his mind recovered, Luo Fan couldn't help letting out a sigh. However, he suddenly realized that he had fallen into that state of perception. He felt that not much time had passed, but in reality, more than 1,000,000 years had passed in the outside world. Currently, the untainted world had already recovered from the damage caused by the great tribulation of heaven and earth. What appeared in front of Luo Fan was another incomparably prosperous cultivation civilization. It was another incomparably beautiful and powerful world that was full of vitality. The alliance leader of the righteous Tao Alliance had survived the great tribulation of heaven and earth, so the entire righteous Tao Alliance naturally survived. Due to the great role that the righteous Tao Alliance played in the great tribulation of heaven and earth, the righteous Tao Alliance had an unimaginable authority in the hearts of the remaining living beings. After the great tribulation, the righteous Tao Alliance had become the orthodoxy of the world and the leader that was recognized by many cultivators. With this backbone, the chaos that had originally occurred after the Great Tribulation did not appear. The entire untainted world stepped into the process of recovery and development in an unimaginably smooth manner. The cultivation system was established at the fastest speed and began to nurture cultivators at an unimaginable speed. As a result, the number of cultivators in the untainted world not only recovered to the number before the Great Tribulation, but the quality was also at least a level higher than before. Chapter 1952. Sensing the various changes in the untainted world, Luo Fan's heart suddenly shook. He took a light step forward, and his figure had already crossed the layers of spacetime and arrived at a strange place in the depths of the untainted world. There used to be a passageway leading to the great Tianyuan world. Originally, it was also the place that Luo Fan had been guarding. Even when he left, he had already set up sufficient defenses to protect the area where the passageway was located. However, at this moment, when he arrived here again, he discovered that it wasn't just the passageway, even that region had completely disappeared. He could not find any trace of it. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan could only sigh. In fact, he had already expected such a situation. After all, the passageway that passed through the state of chaos had to resist the supreme pressure of the state of chaos every moment it existed. This might not be a big deal to a true saint, but once a true saint suddenly thought of it, it would only take a few minutes for him to withdraw it. It was already a miracle that it could last until now before disappearing. Looking at the emptiness in front of him, Luo Fan sighed. He turned around and took a step forward, leaving the void. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the center of the world group. At this moment, Hong Jun, who was cultivating in seclusion in a certain world, had a rather condensed aura. Faintly, there was some indescribable change brewing in his body. With one look, Luo Fan knew that Hong Jun was stepping into the innate zenith heaven. That's right, he was not stepping into the perfected immortal realm or the golden immortal realm. Instead, he had broken through 6 levels and was stepping into the innate zenith heaven, which was a few levels higher. Even under normal circumstances, it was an unimaginably fast speed to achieve such progress in over 1,000,000 years. Currently, Hong Jun was using the slowest cultivation method to improve his realm. With such a speed, it was even more heaven-defying. He's actually so fast. What method did he use to achieve such a speed? This thought flashed through his mind. In the end, Luo Fan shook his head and could not help but laugh. No matter what method Hong Jun had, it was at most a low-level fortuitous encounter. To him, it was completely meaningless. Immediately, he turned his gaze towards his other disciples, as well as his son, Luo Fu. Luo Fu and the others were scattered all over the world. Even the great tribulation of heaven and earth of the primordial world more than 1,000,000 years ago could not wake them up. Thus, they wholeheartedly sorted out their worldview. But now all of them had achieved initial success. But now all of them were preparing to recultivate. After sorting out his worldview, the foundation of his past cultivation was no longer compatible with him. Under such circumstances, if he continued to cultivate like this, the final result would inevitably be that the more he cultivated, the more unstable his foundation would become. It would be good if he could not progress at any point in time, but if he was unlucky, he might not be able to control his own power at any point in time. His body shattered and collapsed, completely turning into bubbles. Therefore, it could be said that after sorting out one's worldview, it was necessary to rebuild one's cultivation foundation and start the path of cultivation all over again. Previously, they did not directly cripple their cultivation base to recultivate next to Luo Fan. Now that they planned to recultivate, they no longer had the face to look for Luo Fan's protection again. Therefore, they only made their own preparations. They only set up layers of defense in their secluded cultivation places to avoid being disturbed during the process of recultivating. They had obtained the true teachings of Luo Fan. The defense they set up was naturally a few levels stronger than the defense set up by other cultivators in the primordial world. Even the alliance leader of the Righteous Tao Alliance, who was already a rank 5 pseudo-saint, was far weaker than them in terms of such means. In other words, although their strength was at the innate zenith heaven realm, it was still much weaker than the entire Righteous Tao Alliance. However, if they had enough time to prepare, it would not be a pipe dream for them to defeat the alliance leader of the entire Righteous Tao Alliance. Therefore, although they did not directly seek for Luo Fan's protection, their current preparations were actually quite safe. Seeing this, Luo Fan also gave up on the idea of summoning them. After teaching them the mysteries of the worldview, they could actually be considered to have completely graduated, especially now that they had sorted out their own worldviews. For them, Luo Fan could only be regarded as a forerunner at best. The only thing they could use from Luo Fan was the cultivation experience of the worldview. Apart from that, all the mysteries of cultivation and all the mysteries that he had comprehended were already incompatible with their own understanding and worldview. Even if he were to forcefully teach them, it would not be of much benefit to them. In fact, it might even bring about great harm. In this way, if they had not graduated, then what was it? Since they were considered to have graduated, then to Luo Fan their own choice was their own business. He could give them some suggestions and give them some analysis, but he was no longer qualified to arrange cultivation for them. Parents watch their children get married and start a career. Perhaps that's my current mentality. After a long time, Luo Fan sighed. He sat cross-legged in the middle of the world group and closed his eyes. When his main body helped the primordial world survive the third great tribulation of the world, his clone had already left the mysterious power and stepped into the world formed after the two fragments of the world collided and fused. In the state of boundless primal chaos, the time between any two perfect worlds was independent. Perhaps, at a higher level, the time was unified, but at least, within the scope of Luo Fan's current understanding, the time between the two was independent. Although his main body had been in the primordial world for more than 1,000,000 years, in reality, his clone felt that only a few thousand years had passed. During this period of time, although it was not too short, It was really insignificant compared to more than 1,000,000 years. This was compared to the hundreds of millions of years he had spent here. Compared to the short 1,000,000 years he had spent on the other side, it was almost the complete opposite, only time was completely independent. That was why such a situation could have happened just now. In fact, Luo Fan even vaguely suspected that the difference in time was very likely related to his will and his main body's thoughts. Of course, where the correlation was and what kind of mechanism was used were as profound as the mysteries of a true sage to him. It was not something he could understand at the moment. Of course, he wasn't lacking in self-knowledge. Hence, he didn't spend too much time and effort on this. Instead, he focused his attention on the various mysteries that he could understand. A few thousand years was more than enough time for the collision between the two worlds. In these few thousand years, the collision between the two worlds had completely ended. In the end, as Luo Fan had expected, the world where Empty Maiden and Hun Ku were in a different timeline had obtained the final victory. Now, in the void in front of him, the world that was originally like a silver moon had now completely turned into a huge sun. Although the surface of the sun was a little mottled, it was undeniably dazzling. With a slight movement of his heart, Luo Fan touched the mysterious power, and in the blink of an eye, his figure had already disappeared into the power. Then, in the void in front of the platform, a bright light suddenly broke through the void and rushed directly toward the mottled sun. Finally, it brazenly broke through the obstruction of the sun. It directly rushed into the sun. At the same time, a bright light fell from the sky. It violently smashed toward the ground of that world. If it was before, Luo Fan would never be able to control his own figure. He could only smash on the ground and make a huge crater. But now, after going through the third tribulation, whether it was the power of his divine sense or other aspects, there had been a qualitative improvement. Under the effect of the power, although he could not completely control his body, he finally had the power to weaken the sweeping impact. In the end, just as his figure was about to smash into the ground, he suddenly stopped. His figure was hovering in a rather embarrassing state, and he was about to smash into the ground. When he found that he had already neutralized the powerful force, he heaved a sigh of relief. His figure flashed and disappeared on the spot, arriving at the broken heaven realm. Although this world had devoured the other world, it had paid a huge price in the collision between the world and the world. At this moment, the number of living beings in the entire world had been reduced to less than 1/10,000th of the original number. The entire world was filled with cracks, and the rules and laws were in chaos everywhere. The great Tao in the dark seemed to have eaten too much and was bulging as if it could explode at any time. As for the heaven realm, which bore the brunt of the attack, it had already been reduced to ruins. The countless clouds and mist that had originally illuminated the heaven realm like a fairyland were now scattered in all directions, looking like incomparably thick smoke of gunpowder. As for the heavenly court, there was almost no complete building at this moment. It seemed like it had been ravaged countless times. At this moment, Hun Ku and Empty Maiden from a different timeline were standing together. They looked at the world in front of them with a somewhat relaxed and somewhat reluctant expression. When Luo Fan appeared, as the heavenly emperor of this world, Hun Ku was the first to discover his arrival. She could not help but be surprised. "Father, I thought something happened to you. It's great that you're fine." Empty Maiden from a different timeline also discovered Luo Fan's existence, and she could not help but feel relieved. "You're finally back. I thought you had found a better place and left this world completely," she said with a smile. Very quickly, her expression changed. "You seem to be very different from before. It's just a tribulation. It's nothing." Luo Fan just smiled. "No, it's not this kind of difference. What exactly is the difference?" The air hostess in the alternate timeline frowned slightly at this moment, as if she was thinking about what was wrong with Luo Fan. It made her feel that there was an essential difference between the Luo fan in front of her and the Luo fan she knew before. After thinking for a while, she suddenly came to a realization. You're the original body? Previously, Luo fan came to this world with a doppelganger, so Empty Maiden from a different timeline was quite clear about it. She had long since gotten used to this. Just now, when Luo fan's real body directly descended, it gave her a strange feeling. For her who was already used to the feeling of doppelganger, it was as conspicuous as a firefly in the dark. However, because she had never thought about this before, she did not think about this just now. Now, she suddenly had an idea. When she thought of this, she was instantly dumbfounded. She couldn't believe what she had sensed. Have you given up the Earth universe? Empty Maiden from a different timeline showed a look of disbelief. Space Maiden, who lived in a different timeline, couldn't be clearer about the huge gap between each perfect heaven and earth. It was already extremely difficult to leave a perfect heaven and earth, and it would be 10 times more difficult to return to it. Under such circumstances, Luo fan's real body directly left the Earth universe and stepped into this perfect world, leaving no trace in the Earth universe. What was the difference between this and completely giving up the Earth universe? And this was especially so for her. After all, the reason why she left the Earth universe was by chance. Now she could not go back, and she could not find the Earth universe at all. It was impossible. Seeing something that she wanted but could not get, it was abandoned in the hands of others. But in the hands of others, it was like a pair of worn-out shoes. This feeling was rather complicated. Luo fan listened. But he just smiled faintly and said, "Of course not. Every perfect world is a wonderful resource. How can I give it up so easily? I have already left a backup in the Earth universe. If I want to go back, I can go back at any time." Hearing this, Empty Maiden's eyes lit up and she said, "You really can go back at any time?" Originally, she thought that Luo fan had created such a doppelganger to enter this world because he wanted to completely give up on this doppelganger. She had never thought that this doppelganger could return to the Earth universe. Therefore, he had never thought about it in this direction. She did not think that she could return to the Earth universe through Luo fan. Therefore, and she had never made such a request to Luo fan. Now that she heard this, she could not help but be tempted. "That backup plan of yours, can you let me go back as well?" she said with rare excitement. Hearing this, Luo fan smiled and said, "Of course you can. In fact, if you want to do it, it will be extremely easy. After all, you have a connection with that power." Hearing this, Empty Maiden from a different timeline could not help but be stunned. After a long time, she smiled bitterly and said, "It turns out that my mind has always been shackled by my original ideas. That power was so mysterious and abstruse. She only had a very preliminary understanding and use of that power, but she could already travel between the various perfect worlds formed by the fragments of the big world. If she were to dig deeper, to what extent would she be able to reach? What was the big deal about returning to a perfect world with her own existence imprint? Perhaps he even wanted to return to the timeline that she had left, which didn't exist yet. It wasn't impossible at all. Understanding this, she did not have much interest in Luo fan's backup. All she could think about was to quickly explore the power of that power and work hard to strengthen her control over that power. Seeing her like this, Luo fan only smiled faintly and did not say anything. He turned to Hun Ku and said, "There are many things waiting to be done in this world. This is the time for you to show your strength. Don't miss it." Hearing this, Hun Ku naturally nodded and said, "It's all thanks to Dad. If you did not shatter the other world, the situation in this world would be countless times more tragic. If that was the case, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to make such an easy choice now." Saying that, Hun Ku looked a little emotional. This time's tribulation was more terrifying than any tribulation that this world had encountered before. However, this tribulation was much easier to pass than the previous one. Of course, this ease referred to the strength and difficulty of the tribulation, but not the absolute degree of ease. In terms of how troublesome it was, spending a few thousand years to get through this tribulation wasn't easy at all. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "It's just a coincidence. You can go, there's no need to pay attention to us." Hun Ku nodded and bowed. Then, she turned around and entered the heavenly court. She began to gather the remaining forces and began to reorganize them to repair this world. At this moment, the boundless starry sky above was no longer as orderly as before. Instead, it had become chaotic. It was filled with empty starry sky. Looking up, it was as if a giant beast had gnawed on it. Luo Fan swept his gaze over and knew that there was not a tenth of the star gods left in the starry sky. The huge formation that had played a huge role in the tribulation had completely disappeared. At this moment, although the entire starry sky was not completely silent, it was not much better than a deathly stillness. Let's go. It's our turn to act now. Looking at this, Luo Fan sighed and said, Chapter 1953. The two of them nodded and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, they traversed the endless spacetime and arrived at the deepest part of the starry sky, the first point of contact where the two worlds collided. The reason why Luo Fan had come here was because he had received an extremely strong feeling after stepping into this world. In this place, there was a crisis that could only be dealt with by existences at the level of him and Sky Maiden from a different timeline. This danger would not affect this world for the time being, but if it was allowed to continue, the danger would become more and more dangerous, and the impact would be greater and greater. In the end, it might even develop into another shocking calamity that could destroy this world. Even if there was such a possibility, Luo Fan could not allow this danger to continue. After all, he had put in a lot of effort to protect this world. Moreover, the danger seemed to not only contain danger, but also some kind of opportunity that would allow him to obtain enough benefits. Under such circumstances, how could he not care about the danger in the deepest part of the starry sky? It was the same for Sky Maiden from an alternate timeline. After Luo Fan stepped into this world, he was attracted by the aura and intuitively sensed the strong existence of danger in the deepest part of the starry sky. It was precisely because of this that such a situation had occurred. When Luo Fan and Sky Maiden from an alternate timeline arrived at the deepest part of the starry sky, they discovered that there was a small singularity lying quietly in the depths of the starry sky. From time to time, it would emit a mysterious and obscure wave that spread into the world and beyond. It was as if it was summoning something, or as if it was giving birth to something. It really is a fragment of a great world. The mysteries that it occasionally reveals are beyond our understanding. Luo Fan sighed. Ever since he stepped into this world, he had encountered countless mysteries. He had encountered countless mysterious incidents, and almost all of them were beyond his understanding. Compared to the other perfect worlds, this seemed to be many times more difficult. Every time it happened, it made him, who was already a little proud, realize how insignificant he was. It was the same for the singularity in front of him. In that singularity, time, space, matter, and energy, they were all combined together in a way that he had never seen before. They seemed to be communicating with everything in this world, yet they also seemed to be completely isolated from everything in this world. There was no connection at all. This seems to be summoning some kind of terrifying existence. Space Maiden from a different timeline said with an inexplicable expression. Compared to the many perfect worlds that Luo Fan had visited, the empty lady in a different timeline was much less knowledgeable. Ever since she met up with Luo Fan, the overwhelming experience had almost made her a little numb. As for the specifics, we'll have to study it carefully first. Luo Fan just sighed. His heart skipped a beat. He communicated with that power, and a mysterious power surged out of thin air and enveloped the singularity. This kind of power, compared to the might of the power itself, it was as insignificant as an ant compared to a planet. However, the strength of this power had already reached an unimaginable level. Although the singularity itself did not change much in the face of this power, the various mysterious ripples emitted by the singularity were instantly blocked. Following this change, the whole world trembled slightly. There seemed to be some kind of existence trembling outside the world. Immediately after, Luo Fan felt his mind lighten. The strong sense of crisis that had been brewing in his heart was suddenly reduced by more than half. When he realized this, Luo Fan's expression lightened at first. Then, he raised it again. It seemed like the singularity was really summoning some kind of existence. Moreover, that existence was so terrifying that it might have reached an unimaginable level. It was enough to pose a threat to the whole world and all living beings in this world, including himself. Now, although Luo Fan had used a bit of the power to restrict the summoning waves emitted by the singularity, it was obviously only a temporary solution. First of all, he could not stay here forever and mobilize the power to envelop the singularity. Secondly, even if he could achieve this step, that kind of summoning had not been completely eliminated. It was still working in a way that Luo Fan could not sense at all, continuing to summon that indescribable existence. It was just that the time had been pushed back a lot. When he restricted the waves, only half of the sense of crisis had disappeared. There was still a small part of it left. It seems like this method is only treating the symptoms and not the root cause. If we really want to solve this problem, the best way is to destroy it completely, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline said solemnly. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan frowned. After thinking about it, his heart stirred and a body walked out of his body. This was one of his doppelgangers, a doppelganger that was almost identical to the doppelganger he had sent into this world back then. Seeing this, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline came to a sudden realization. She smiled and a clone also walked out of her body. However, compared to Luo Fan's clone, which seemed to have similar strength as his main body, the clone created by the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline was less than a third of the main body's strength. Although she was still at the same level and still had the same cultivation realm and power as before, she was still 2/3 weaker. This was obviously a difference caused by the difference in cultivation paths. To the current Luo Fan, all of his cultivation, all of it came from his worldview of the laws. In other words, as long as his worldview was intact, he would be able to possess all of his strength and unleash all of the power represented by this worldview. Therefore, as long as he had the same willpower, regardless of whether it was his clone or his main body, they were all the same to him. Under such circumstances, although he was just casually creating a clone, it could still possess strength comparable to his main body. In contrast, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline was different. All of her cultivation had been cultivated bit by bit over a long period of time. Apart from her own understanding of cultivation, apart from the cultivation brought about by her understanding of heaven and earth, a large part of it was due to other factors. For example, it was formed by polishing and tempering over a long period of time. Under such circumstances, her clone would lose a large portion of its other elements, so it would naturally be unable to perfectly possess all of her cultivation and strength. Now that this clone could possess 1/3 of her strength, it was already considered an extraordinary display of her strength. The Space Maiden in the alternate timeline could only sigh inwardly at the difference between her clones. However, it was obvious that this clone of hers was already sufficient. After all, the two of them were merely relying on their doppelgangers to probe the singularity. Luo Fan didn't care about how strong the clone of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline was. When he saw his clone, he nodded. His clone took a step forward and stepped into the range of the power restriction. At the same time, the clone of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline. He also stepped into the restriction. The moment he stepped into the restriction, all sorts of indescribable vibrations were generated from all directions and swarmed towards them. They were completely drowned in it. At this moment, the expression of Luo Fan's clone changed slightly as this thought flashed through his mind. Is this the feeling of the summoning being strengthened countless times? After the singularity was sealed, it was still emitting that kind of fluctuation all the time. However, that fluctuation could no longer dissipate. Instead, it was blocked by the power and continued to accumulate within the power. As time passed, the summoning fluctuation within the power would naturally become stronger. As time passed, the summoning fluctuation within the power would naturally become larger and larger. It was getting more and more terrifying. Although Luo Fan and the others had only delayed it for a short while, the power now, it had already grown countless times stronger than before. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone felt that the fluctuation had completely ignored all of his defenses and brazenly penetrated into his body. It penetrated deep into his life source and attacked the life essence that had turned into a ball with a ring, shaking it continuously. Due to this fluctuation, his law power didn't seem to exist at all and couldn't affect it at all. He couldn't stop it from shaking the life essence that had turned into the manifestation of the law worldview. If it weren't for the law power's ability to stabilize the law worldview, Luo Fan would have been completely at the mercy of the other party. At this moment, the empty lady's clone from the alternate timeline beside him exclaimed. Shortly after, his body seemed to be torn apart by countless monsters. From the inside to the outside, every inch of his body and every bit of his strength was completely torn apart. In the blink of an eye, he had already turned into a puff of smoke and disappeared into thin air. If it was just smoke, it wouldn't be much for an existence at the level of the empty lady's clone from the alternate timeline. If she wanted to, she could completely recover at any time. However, during this process, the tearing power was still acting on her body. Every fragment and every particle in the smoke was constantly being torn apart, causing the smoke to continuously transform into even finer particles. Just like that, it didn't take long for the empty lady's clone from the alternate timeline to turn into tiny particles that even Luo Fan couldn't find or sense. In the end, she completely disappeared from the universe. At the same time, Space Maiden, who was in an alternate timeline, instantly lost all sense of her clone. It's actually so terrifying. At this moment, Luo Fan was finally horrified. The power of the ripples had actually reached such a level after being strengthened countless times. If he had not appeared and allowed the ripples to spread throughout the world, he did not even dare to imagine what kind of damage it would cause to the world in the end. He did not even dare to imagine what the existence that was summoned would do to the world in the end. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's clone narrowed his eyes. Without any hesitation, he lifted his foot and stepped toward the singularity. The singularity that he had restricted was only tens of thousands of miles in circumference. In the past, he only needed a thought to cross it. He could cross it in an instant with just a thought. It was nothing at all. However, at this moment, under the impact of the countless waves, he could only use all of his law power to protect his life essence and his body. Naturally, he couldn't use the ability to cross tens of thousands of miles with just a thought. At this moment, he could only use ordinary flying techniques to rush toward the singularity. Because of this, although his speed was much faster than that of ordinary living beings, it still took him dozens of seconds to cross the distance of tens of thousands of miles and arrive in front of the singularity. It had only been a few dozen seconds, but the powerful energy waves emitted by the singularity had strengthened once again. It had even reached the point where his body had started to collapse, and wisps of smoke were constantly being emitted from his body. If it wasn't for the fact that his law power was quite powerful in protecting his worldview and that his body's essence was not damaged during this process, he might have already fallen into the same situation as the empty lady's clone in the alternate timeline. The singularity. It was an extremely mysterious point that could not even be described with words. It could only be described as strange. The singularity. There was no size, no inside or outside, no front or back, and no difference between the past, present, and future. It was there alone, as if it was already an inseparable, absolutely perfect, complete individual. If it wasn't for the waves that were constantly emitting from it, indicating that this was not the true appearance of the singularity, Luo Fan might have thought so too. Seeing that the singularity was already in front of him, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. He suddenly raised his hand and grabbed toward the singularity. In an instant, he grasped the singularity. With a soft bang, his palm instantly turned into smoke. Then, the smoke turned into nothingness in the blink of an eye, completely disappearing. Throughout the entire process, he didn't even realize what kind of power or attack had caused his palm to completely disappear. It was as if his palm itself was about to collapse and turn into smoke and disappear completely. It's really strange. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, his collapsed arm started to grow again. Not long after, it had completely recovered to its original, undamaged appearance. However, there were still wisps of smoke continuously emitting from his arm. In a situation where his concept of existence was completely intact, any injuries on his body, including the collapse of his life force, were merely superficial wounds that he could recover from at any time. Regrowing a broken arm was nothing at all. As these thoughts flashed across his mind, Luo Fan quickly made a decision. He suddenly raised his hand and grabbed a handful of the waves emitted from the singularity. Following those waves, he started to shoot out rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he had already reverberated hundreds of thousands of times in the confined area within a radius of tens of thousands of miles. His afterimages had instantly covered the entire area within a radius of tens of thousands of miles, making it seem as if the area within a radius of tens of thousands of miles was completely filled with his clones. This scene looked rather tragic. However, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. This situation was already much better than what he had imagined. At the very least, as he followed the waves and reverberated in the confined area, the power that had been constantly penetrating into his body to completely destroy his life force and his materialized worldview had already stopped growing. It was as if time had completely stopped for him compared to the countless waves. In the face of such a situation, his initial situation naturally didn't change much compared to before. He still had to use almost all of his law power to protect his worldview from the fate of his worldview being completely torn apart by that power. But as time passed, as he became more familiar with this power, he gradually found a way to deal with it. He could use less and less law power to offset the damage this power caused to his worldview. In other words, he could draw out more and more law power to do other things he wanted to do. The pause in time was not an illusion. In fact, when he was in this state, compared to the singularity and the other waves, time had indeed completely stopped. At the very least, the connection between his main body and his clones seemed to have been strengthened billions of times, and it was still getting stronger. It was as if the time of more and more clones had been compressed into a split second and poured into the will of his main body. If it wasn't for Luo Fan's ability to sense time and equate billions of years with a split second, such a change might have been enough to make him either collapse or give up on this clone. Chapter 1954. In this situation, Luo Fan didn't waste too much time thinking about it. Instead, he followed his previous plan and grabbed onto the fluctuation, going against the flow and moving towards the source of the fluctuation step by step. Although the speed of the wave was extremely fast, Luo Fan and the wave itself existed in a state of time. As long as he moved in this direction, he would definitely be able to go against the wave and reach its source one day. In the end, he would find a way to enter the singularity. With every step he took, it was equivalent to going against the endless impact head-on. At every moment, there was endless pain pouring into his body from all over his body. The torture he suffered at every moment was like being cut by 1,000 knives. As for the consumption of nomological powers, there was no need to even mention it. The consumption of nomological powers at every moment was enough to completely drain any level 3 Supreme Emperor. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan's concept of existence was indestructible and that there was endless law power constantly surging out from the depths of his body to fill up the endless emptiness in his body, he might have already lost all his power in just a few breaths. After consuming such a large amount of magic power and energy, Luo Fan's achievements were quite commendable. No matter how fast the ripples spread, his body was still moving forward on an absolute level. In other words, even though he was being rapidly transported backwards during the process, he was able to rely on his boundless law power to forcefully withstand the force of the gravitational pull and move a little closer to the source of the singularity. Compared to the distance the ripples traveled, this small distance was nothing. It wasn't much at all, but it was still progress. If this continued, there would be a day. He would eventually reach his destination, at least for Luo Fan's doppelganger. Time had already passed. 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 10,000,000 years, 100,000,000 years. Unknowingly, billions of years had already passed. The passage of billions of years was practically non-existent to the outside world. Everything in the outside world was completely suspended for this clone. Therefore, even though it took such a long time, the outside world didn't actually change because of this. If there was one, it could only be Luo Fan's main body. Because the main body's time was paused, the clone itself was experiencing a longer and longer time. Therefore, to the main body, it was as if the flow of time was accelerating. Endless light was evolving, and in this process, it was constantly accumulating and strengthening. From the beginning, it was only a few days and an instant. Who knew how many hundreds of millions of years had passed, which was equivalent to an instant? An ordinary cultivator would not be able to withstand such a compression of time. He would definitely not be able to withstand such an intense change at the first moment. His mind and time would completely collapse in that instant. However, to Luo Fan, this was obviously impossible. For him, who could equate an instant with 1,000,000,000 trillion years, this degree of time compression only made him feel a little concerned. He didn't even feel that it was strenuous for him. Naturally, his mind wouldn't collapse because of this. After a moment in the outside world, Luo Fan's clone had already forcefully passed through a layer of mysterious barrier while compressing the time of his main body for billions of years. He had entered an indescribable place. He had finally broken through the layers of barriers. Following the fluctuations, he brazenly stepped into the source of the fluctuations and stepped into the singularity. That singularity seemed to have no size, no top or bottom, no front or back, and no inside or outside. Actually, calling it a point was already a very inaccurate description. However, in reality, after passing through that mysterious barrier and stepping into the interior of the singularity, one would discover that it was as if they had crossed an extremely large transmission array and arrived at an unimaginable place. A place where time, space, matter, and energy were all mixed together in an indescribable way. At a glance, everything looked blurry here. Up and down, left and right, front and back, the past, the present, and the future, everything was mixed together in an unimaginable way. Originally, normal time transitions would no longer have any effect on Luo Fan. In other words, even if the past, present, and future became extremely chaotic and mixed together, Luo Fan would still be able to remain unaffected during this process. He would still be able to maintain his sense of self and his own space-time dimension. It was as if he was completely independent of all the changes in the outside world. In that case, entering that kind of environment would be like stepping into an illusion. Everything that changed around him was just a change of light and shadow. No matter how intense the change was, it would only increase his knowledge. However, this was clearly not the case in the interior of the singularity in front of him. In this place, time, space, matter, and energy all existed in an absolute manner. In other words, although Luo Fan had his own unique space-time dimension, everything about him was affected by the outside world during this process. The space of the outside world affected his own space. The time of the outside world affected his own time. The matter of the outside world affected the matter that made him. The energy of the outside world affected his power of laws. Under such circumstances, when he stepped into this place, he instantly felt like he was in a daze. Countless figures of him from the past, present, and future appeared around him. Moreover, these figures were of the same origin as his will. They were either the figures that created him now or the figures that would become his achievements in the future. As for his own space, it also became chaotic because of the chaos in the outside world. Of course, this kind of chaos was only seen from the outside and from a macroscopic point of view. In fact, he couldn't even feel the chaos in his own space because his will was also in the midst of that chaos. This was because this kind of chaos corresponded to the chaos in the space. Therefore, to him, this kind of chaos was as if it didn't exist at all. The space-time dimension here is of a higher level and more perfect than mine. At this moment, Luo Fan already understood what was going on. The situation inside the singularity clearly showed one thing, and that was, the space-time dimension here had a higher level of absoluteness than his. This kind of absoluteness even surpassed the normal perfect world. This was the only way such a situation could occur. His own unique space-time dimension was completely unable to resist this kind of change. He could only watch as his own space-time and his own matter and energy were affected by the outside world. Fortunately, it was a doppelganger that entered the singularity and not his actual body. If his actual body had really stepped into the singularity, what awaited him would have been him completely immersed in the singularity. He might have had to wait for his senses to go through billions of trillions of years before he could wake up due to some kind of inspiration and discover the various kinds of chaos that he had encountered. Only then would he have a tiny chance of escaping. However, things were different now. His clone was indeed completely affected by the various kinds of chaos in the singularity and was also in that kind of chaos. However, his avatar in the outside world saw everything. His thoughts were on a higher, macroscopic level, and he was in complete control of this change. He clearly grasped every detail of the chaos. At this moment, he instinctively realized something. This is a great opportunity for me to perfect my own unique space-time dimension. The appearance of this realization made the annoyance and worry that had originally appeared in his heart disappear completely. In an instant, all of them disappeared. What replaced them was a sense of anticipation, a sense of joy. Furthermore, at this point in time, he finally understood why he still felt that this was a great opportunity for him when he sensed the danger in this place. Perhaps his opportunity lay here, in the revelation of his unique space-time dimension. As for the danger that the fluctuations produced by the singularity might cause and the destruction that it might cause to this world, he no longer cared about it. His relationship with this world could at most be considered as a form of gratitude. This world had helped him obtain the spirit treasure embryo, and he had also helped this world overcome two huge tribulations. No matter how one looked at it, they were even. Now that he was willing to come here and help this world overcome this crisis, it could be considered that he had taken his friendship with this world into consideration. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not need to give up his opportunity for this world, nor did he need to pay any price for this world. Therefore, at this moment, it was really normal for him to completely ignore the danger that this singularity might cause. In this state of mind, his expression had already relaxed, and there was even a faint smile on his face. It was as if he had discovered something great. To Luo Fan, all of this had been hundreds of millions of years, but to Sky Maiden, who was in a different timeline, it was only a moment. To her, after her clone was completely destroyed, countless figures of Luo Fan suddenly appeared in the void that was imprisoned by the mysterious power in front of her. Soon after, these figures dissipated one by one, and Luo Fan's clone also disappeared without a trace. Just as she thought that Luo Fan's clone had been completely destroyed like her, Luo Fan, who was beside her, revealed an unfathomable smile instead. She was at a loss for a moment. What did you discover? Sky Maiden, who was in a different timeline, could not help but ask Luo Fan in the end. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, I just found where the opportunity is. Opportunity? The eyes of the air hostess in the alternate timeline lit up at this moment. She was obviously very interested in the opportunity that Luo Fan had mentioned. Unfortunately, Luo Fan sighed and said, This is my opportunity. You can't enter the singularity with your clone, so you won't be able to obtain this opportunity no matter what. Even if I wanted to teach you, I wouldn't be able to. When Sky Maiden heard this, she could not help but look disappointed and said, That's a pity. Naturally, she did not think that Luo Fan would lie to her about this. Based on her understanding of Luo Fan, he would at most hide some things. At most, he would only hide some things, but once he said it, it would never be a lie. This point had been deeply engraved in the depths of her heart. Ever since Luo Fan had given up on snatching the mysterious stone from her. Therefore, at that moment, she was only thinking about how to send her clone into the singularity. Unfortunately, the difficulty of achieving this goal had increased by 100 or even 1,000 times compared to before. However, what was even more unfortunate was that the difficulty of achieving this goal had increased by 100 or even 1,000 times compared to before. Moreover, with every minute and second that she delayed, the difficulty of the task would increase at an alarming rate. At that moment, the singularity was still emitting endless mysterious fluctuations. The fluctuations kept stacking and getting stronger. With every passing minute and second, it became more troublesome and terrifying. These fluctuations were constantly stacking up and getting stronger. With every passing second, it was becoming more troublesome and more terrifying. With every passing second, her chances of entering the singularity were decreasing. After thinking for a while, the Empyrean maiden in a different timeline could only sigh and say, It seems that this opportunity is not fated with me. He should have known. I should have used it from the very beginning. The item she was talking about was naturally the one that had brought her through the chaos, the one that felt even more powerful than the primordial essence spirit treasure. If he had used that treasure to protect himself from the start, he would not have been able to survive. However, it was definitely able to withstand the terrifying fluctuations emitted by the singularity, allowing his clone to directly step into the singularity. Unfortunately, she had underestimated the fluctuations emitted by the singularity and wanted to enter it empty-handed. However, she had not expected that she had overestimated herself. In the end, she had missed the best opportunity to enter the singularity. In fact, it could even be said to be the only opportunity to enter the singularity. Now, even she regretted it. If he wanted to use that treasure, he wouldn't be able to do so. It was not that he couldn't use that treasure to cross the barrier of the fluctuations. If he stepped into the singularity, that treasure could even cross the chaos easily. How could the fluctuations emitted by the singularity compare to the chaos? It was because, if he wanted to activate that treasure to resist the fluctuations, it would cause an earth-shattering commotion. It might even destroy more than 1/10 of this world. This was obviously unacceptable to Empyrean Maiden, who had inexplicable feelings for this world, and even Hun Ku, whom she cared about, was in this world. Sighing, she could only look at Luo Fan with a complicated expression. Before Luo Fan had passed through the third tribulation, he was already stronger than the Empyrean Maiden in a different timeline. Now that he had passed through the third tribulation, he had completely surpassed her. He naturally knew what the Empyrean Maiden in a different timeline had and what her concerns were. However, at this moment, He could only shrug his shoulders helplessly. The Empyrean maiden in a different timeline smiled bitterly. She sat cross-legged and focused on the singularity in front of her. She focused on the mysterious and terrifying fluctuations emitted by the singularity. She focused on the mysterious power emitted by the strange power that completely confined the fluctuations in the center. All of this revealed all sorts of mysteries that were beyond her understanding. Although she couldn't comprehend it like Luo Fan, who could directly comprehend some of the mysteries of the space-time dimension through the powerful contrast between the space-time dimension and the clone and perfect her own unique space-time dimension, it was still considered a way to comprehend from the perspective of cultivation. Compared to gaining nothing at all, it was clearly much better. Seeing her like this, Luo Fan just smiled and no longer paid attention to her. He began to wholeheartedly focus his mind and attention on the clone and the singularity. The distortion that the doppelganger had suffered had almost completely destroyed his own unique space-time dimension. This allowed him to truly feel how fragile his space-time dimension was. Compared to the space-time dimension of a true sage, there was a huge difference. At this moment, he was not trying to comprehend the mysteries of the space-time dimension in the singularity. Instead, he was trying to sense the distortion of his avatar. He wanted to understand the difference between this distortion and the normal state of his main body. He also wanted to see what the changes in the details brought about by this difference were. Through this comprehension, he began to re-establish the basic concept of the space-time dimension bit by bit and began to understand his own space-time dimension from the basic level. For him, this process was almost equivalent to completely crushing himself and using his remaining rationality to study the fragments that he had crushed. Not only did it feel strange, but it was also painful. However, Luo Fan, who had long been accustomed to pain, did not slack off because of this. Instead, he continued to compare and delve deeper into the basic level of the space-time dimension. His doppelganger was absolutely affected by the time distortion. The past, present, and future were mixed together. At this time, the doppelganger from countless time periods were gathered together, and at the same time, it had an extremely deep communication with his main body. This allowed Luo Fan to have any thoughts, and anything he wanted to know, even without going through the process. His future doppelganger could clearly understand it. Chapter 1955. There were billions of thoughts in every instant. Billions of thoughts were constantly exchanged between the clone and the main body. Almost at every moment, he had to search for a bit of inspiration to improve his understanding of the space-time dimension from these endless thoughts and thoughts. This was obviously an extremely complicated and huge project. During this process, Luo Fan's perception of time was gradually extended. Every instant seemed to have turned into billions of years in his perception. This also brought out his special ability to equate an instant with 1 billion years to its limit. In a trance, a circle of faintly discernible distortions gradually appeared around Luo Fan's body. This distortion reached the depths of spacetime. It was the distortion of time and space, and the appearance of this distortion was none other than the conflict between his unique spacetime dimension and the spacetime of the outside world. The appearance of this distortion meant that his unique spacetime dimension had been activated at this moment. Moreover, it was undergoing an extremely huge change. And this clearly also meant that his understanding of the spacetime dimension had gradually touched upon the essence. At the very least, it had touched upon the essence that he understood. The distortion that formed around him became more and more intense and obvious as time passed. Unknowingly, he had already turned into a circle of strange transparent existence, gradually causing his existence to become blurry. It was as if starting from the edge of his body, he was gradually being dyed by the surrounding void and gradually dispersing. This situation was clearly a sign that the unique spacetime dimension around him had gradually stabilized and finally formed a stable layer of separation with the outside world. In the beginning, the Space Maiden in a different timeline did not pay attention to him. However, as the changes happening to his body became more intense, the various mysteries of the space-time dimension gradually became more profound than the power emitted by the strange power in front of him and the various changes caused by the fluctuations surging out of the singularity. At this moment, she finally could not help but be attracted by it. Unknowingly, her attention had already shifted to him. Could this be the legendary space-time dimension? After recognizing the abnormal layer of separation around Luo Fan's body, such a thought suddenly flashed through the Space Maiden's mind. With this thought, she suddenly felt a chill run down her spine. In her experience, among the many worlds and the vast chaos, only the true saints who could touch upon the dimensions of time and space could be touched upon by the true saints, who seemed to her to be extremely high at this time. But at this moment, right in front of her, however, Luo Fan had used the truth to completely shatter this concept of hers. For an existence that had yet to become a true divine, that kind of stable space-time dimension, that absolute separation from the outside world, was she really not hallucinating? Although Luo Fan could faintly sense all of these changes, he didn't care about it at all. At this moment, he could only focus on comprehending and observing the difference in the space-time dimension between his clone and his main body. The space-time dimension is an illusory state, but in the eyes of a true powerhouse, as long as it exists, it doesn't matter if it's illusory or real, it doesn't matter if it's a state or an object, it can be manipulated at will. This thought had appeared in his mind at some point. Following this thought, the originally absolutely illusory space-time dimension suddenly condensed, and a core appeared around Luo Fan's body. This core was only able to wrap around Luo Fan's body. Outside this core, layers of weakening space-time dimension strength slowly spread outwards, and finally radiated out to hundreds of feet away. Even Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, had to avoid it. Just now, it completely disappeared. Because of the appearance of this core, the relationship between Luo Fan's unique space-time dimension and the space-time dimension of the outside world had changed from abrupt separation to a kind of gradual evolution. In other words, it was a kind of relationship that was silently evolving. This kind of evolution. This caused the gap between Luo Fan's unique space-time dimension and the space-time dimension of the outside world to become indistinguishable. This situation was obviously a great improvement. After all, in this way, the conflict between his unique space-time dimension and the space-time dimension of the outside world had been absolutely weakened. For example, previously, to outsiders, his body was already completely blurred, as if it was an illusory shadow, and it was difficult for it to survive. And now, although he was still wrapped by an illusory shadow in the shape of a ball, his real body could still be seen clearly. It was as if he was just covered by a transparent cover. This kind of change made Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, really dumbfounded. Just now, the space-time dimension on Luo Fan's body had completely separated him from the outside world, causing her to gradually be unable to see Luo Fan's figure clearly. She could understand this situation, and she knew that it was because of the difference in space-time dimension, which made it difficult for her to see through the obstacles and truly see through the space-time dimension to the inside of Luo Fan. Although she felt that this was unfathomable, it was ultimately still within the scope of understanding. But what was going on with this change now? Right now, the space-time dimension was clearly still there, but how could the gap between the two space-time dimensions be so seemingly non-existent? How could an ordinary person's vision be able to easily penetrate the barrier between the two space-time dimensions and see Luo Fan in another space-time dimension? For a moment, her mind was in a mess. She vaguely knew that if she could understand the mysteries behind this, she would be at the beginner's level in the space-time dimension. However, since understanding this was equivalent to being at the beginner's level, one could imagine how difficult it would be to understand this. Even after pondering for a long time, Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, could only feel waves of headache. She simply could not truly understand what kind of changes had happened to the space-time dimension on Luo Fan's body. At this moment, Luo Fan opened his eyes that had been tightly shut for a long time. As he opened his eyes, the sphere around him suddenly began to spin, just like a planet that began to rotate gradually. Due to this change, the space-time dimension around the ball began to be driven, and all sorts of indescribable sounds were vaguely produced. It was like thunder rumbling in the depths of the sky, causing Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, to have an inexplicable understanding. Finally, at a certain moment, the space-time dimension that had been stirred up gradually condensed and eventually formed circles around the sphere. Layers of rings firmly protected the ball, causing Luo Fan's figure to completely disappear from the eyes of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline. This time, even with the eyesight of an empty maiden in a different timeline, it was also difficult to penetrate the space-time dimension to see any trace of Luo Fan. It was as if Luo Fan had completely disappeared from the void at this moment. This is an even stronger isolation than before. At this instant, this thought flashed through the mind of the empty lady in the alternate timeline. In the alternate timeline, Space Maiden could only guess the outcome. However, at this moment, Luo Fan was unprecedentedly clear that his understanding of the space-time dimension had taken a huge leap forward. This was because he was communicating with his doppelgangers about the changes in the space-time dimension. In the end, he realized that his understanding of the space-time dimension was lacking. That is, he didn't integrate his worldview of laws into the space-time dimension, just like his concept of existence back then. This view of the world was Luo Fan's view of heaven and earth, of the universe, of all things in the world, and of space-time. It was formed by the integration of the fundamental understanding of the laws and laws, the state of chaos, and everything else. Such a view of the world itself should be the integration of all his ideas and all his existences. Everything that was related to him should be carried out by him. Only then would it be considered complete. However, it had always been his unique space-time dimension. But they were only slightly integrated. Although this integration made him feel extremely comfortable, and he faintly felt that it was completely compatible with his senses, it had already made him completely independent from the space-time dimension of the outside world. However, there was no real core, no real guiding ideology. All the gains, all the improvements, all depended on the accumulation of experience. As such, one could well imagine how fragile the space-time dimension was. It was precisely because of this that the space-time dimension of his doppelgangers was so easily scattered by the space-time dimension inside the singularity. Since he had understood this, it was naturally very easy for Luo Fan to solve this problem. On the other hand, he had integrated all his understanding of the world-view of laws into the space-time dimension, causing the space-time dimension to gradually change during this process, causing all the operating laws within it to begin to change subtly. It was precisely because of this that a core that completely belonged to the space-time dimension began to appear in the space-time dimension. And the image of this core, because of the existence of its guiding ideology, also turned into the appearance of the worldview. Of course, after all, Luo Fan was only carrying out this kind of work. Now, the core of the space-time dimension only had the outline of the worldview. The various details that truly belonged to the worldview still hadn't appeared in the space-time dimension. Only after spending a long time and endless energy to carve and perfect it bit by bit in the future could he truly perfect it. However, even just integrating the outline of the worldview into the space-time dimension was enough to cause a qualitative change in his space-time dimension. For example, at this time, in the point mass, the number of doppelgangers intertwined with the past, present, and future had gradually decreased. By this time, when Luo Fan fully mobilized the space-time dimension and made it look really similar to the worldview, the countless doppelgangers continued to shrink, and in the end, only 3 were left in the singularity. Among these three figures, one represented the doppelganger's past, one represented the doppelganger's present, and one represented the doppelganger's future. However, even if they represented three different time periods, the time interval between these three doppelgangers was extremely short. If one were to forcibly distinguish them, it would probably only be an instant at most. In other words, the doppelganger that represented the past in the blink of an eye. The doppelganger that represented the future in the blink of an eye. This situation clearly meant that the space-time dimension within the singularity was at least slightly stronger than Luo Fan's current unique space-time dimension. Luo Fan was well aware of this, but he was not the least bit discouraged. Instead, he was still full of confidence. He had absolute confidence in completing the perfection of this space-time dimension so that he could completely resist the space-time dimension of the singularity. In the end, he would completely comprehend the true mystery of the singularity and finally be able to operate this mystery. Then, he would be able to eliminate the earth-shattering calamity that the singularity was about to cause. In order to reach that step, what he had to do was very simple. That was to work hard to perfect his space-time dimension and carve the core of the space-time dimension, so that it would truly be on par with his worldview. Under his control, the rotation of the space-time dimension became more and more intense. During this rotation, all kinds of indescribable and wonderful forces were continuously produced and acted on the space-time dimension itself. They began to change the image of the space-time dimension's core in an extremely subtle way. Or, to be more precise, they were changing the composition of the space-time dimension itself, just like what was mentioned before. The space-time dimension itself was merely an illusory state. In order to change its appearance, one naturally needed to change the essence of this illusory state. Only by doing so would the image that was reflected and revealed to the outside world be changed along with it, transforming into a different image. Just by listening to this process, one could tell that it was not a simple process. Even though Luo Fan's understanding of the worldview had reached the realm of deriving the power of laws, and he wanted to fully implement it in the space-time dimension, that was equivalent to perfectly fusing two things that were completely incompatible with each other. Even though Luo Fan's magical powers were endless and he could do things that ordinary creatures and cultivators couldn't do, he still had to give it his all. If he wanted to do this, he would have to give it his all, and the effect might not be too great. In this way, the change in his space-time dimension was naturally a long process. Moreover, during this process, the influence of the space-time dimension on the outside world became greater and greater. This caused Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, to retreat continuously. Before she knew it, she had already retreated tens of thousands of miles away. They were currently in the depths of the starry sky of this part of the world. These changes gradually triggered some kind of mysterious change, causing all the light given off by the stars in the vast starry sky in this world to be stirred up slightly. This situation was as if a huge black hole had suddenly appeared in the depths of the starry sky and started to continuously draw the light of all the stars in the entire starry sky towards it. This change was naturally not obvious at first. However, as time passed, this influence became greater and greater. Gradually, it was as if another huge and bright star had appeared in the depths of the starry sky, causing the creatures that were paying attention to the changes in the stars to involuntarily look over. It was also at this time that Hun Ku, who was in the middle of rebuilding the heavenly court in the heavenly realm, suddenly realized that his parents were still helping him. For a moment, he was extremely touched, and the motivation to reorganize the world became even stronger. Time passed, and 100 years passed in the blink of an eye. Unknowingly, the star that had appeared in the depths of the starry sky had already turned into another sun. It hung in the starry sky, causing the world to be as bright as day even though it was night. At this time, even the creatures that didn't pay attention to the stars noticed this change, and all of them were bewildered. If it wasn't for the celestial Thearcha's order that this was an almighty eliminating a calamity for the world, perhaps this change alone would have been enough to cause even more chaos. Over the past 100 years, the influence of the space-time dimension around Luo Fan's body had already spread to a radius of several million kilometers. Although this scale was insignificant compared to the entire world, if it was placed in the space-time dimension that ordinary cultivators could not even touch or even have such a concept, this scale was already shocking beyond imagination. Because of the changes in the space-time dimension, the starlight in the entire starry sky was constantly being pulled over and driven by the space-time dimension. The starlight continuously revolved around Luo Fan's body, and after an unknown number of revolutions, it once again shot out into the starry sky and into the three realms under the starry sky. It was also because of this that this location had turned into another sun of this world, providing endless light to the night of this world. After all, the change in the space-time dimension did not really turn the place where Luo Fan was into a black hole. Over the past 100 years, many cultivators who thought they were powerful disobeyed Celestial Tharch Hun Ku's words and set off from all over the world to investigate, hoping to find the source of this strange star's appearance. However, these stars were either repelled by Hun Ku's defenses, or destroyed by the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline who was guarding not far from Luo Fan. It could be said that in a certain sense, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline was already protecting Luo Fan. Chapter 1956. As Luo Fan continued to sculpt and modify the space-time dimensional core, the time gap between his three clones in the singularity began to gradually decrease. What appeared on the surface was that the three clones were gradually fusing together. It was as if a person was walking. A moment ago, he was about to land on the ground, and in the next moment, he was about to take a step forward. However, a large portion of his body was overlapping with each other. At this moment, the past, present, and future figures of Luo Fan's clones were gradually fusing together in this manner. If a living being could see this scene, they would definitely have a great understanding of time and the space-time dimensional core. However, it was a pity that only the main body, Luo Fan, could see all of this. None of the other beings, not even Sky Maiden who was in a different timeline, could see these scenes at all, let alone understand the profound principles and mysteries within them. Suddenly, at a certain moment, Luo Fan's heart suddenly shook, and an indescribable feeling of penetration emerged from his heart. In an instant, he stopped the operation of the space-time dimensional core around his body. As he stopped, the space-time dimensional core suddenly stabilized, maintaining an extremely familiar image. It was a sphere with a halo around it. However, at first glance, it was completely the appearance of his world view after it had been condensed. Only through careful observation could one discover that the sphere was somewhat different from his world view in some details. It was still not completely similar, and there was still room for improvement, as well as an outline that could be sculpted. This was clearly the fact that his space-time dimensional core had reached a certain limit. And at this moment, in the singularity, the three figures of the past, present, and future finally completely overlapped, and the time gap between them was finally reduced from its original small size. However, it still existed. It had become completely synchronized, and all the time gaps had completely disappeared. At this moment, there was an indescribable feeling. A complicated expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. That feeling was none other than the feeling that he was about to face the next great tribulation, the fourth great tribulation. He had only just passed the third tribulation, yet he could already sense the fourth tribulation. Even if he dared to fantasize about it, he would not be able to imagine such a speed. This time I can actually sense it so quickly. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? He sighed in his heart. Although his perception of the fourth calamity was still vague, it was almost impossible for him to fix it completely, let alone sensing when the fourth calamity would descend. However, Compared to the previous situation where he was completely clueless and couldn't find the fourth tribulation, this was already an improvement from 0 to 1. It was an extremely fundamental improvement. He thought about it for a while. Luo Fan suppressed all kinds of distracting thought. Regardless of whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to sense the existence of the fourth tribulation so quickly, at least in the long run, it was a good thing for him. Since it was a good thing, there was no need to spend too much effort on it. There were more important things at the moment. However, he had dealt with the singularity. This was also a form of karma. He had obtained great benefits from the existence of the singularity, so he naturally had to deal with all kinds of troubles brought about by the singularity. And now, the real trouble with the singularity was its existence. His clone was completely united in the singularity, representing the space-time dimension of his clone. It was already on par with the space-time dimension of the singularity. This also meant that he could ignore the influence of the space-time dimension of the singularity and see the truth of the singularity. The surrounding space-time dimension was still extremely powerful and chaotic. Because he was not affected by the space-time dimension, Luo Fan could finally clearly feel the overall power of the space-time dimension. The violence and power felt even more terrifying than the higher space-time dimension and vaster than the boundless space-time dimension ocean. When Luo Fan entered it, he was like a small fish in the boundless sea. Although he could swim in it, he still seemed extremely small in front of it. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's clone started to head towards the depths of the space-time dimension. The space-time dimension ocean was mysterious and wonderful. Within it, the space-time dimension was boundless, and its power was earth-shattering. Countless space-time dimensions were born and destroyed, and countless things were born and destroyed. There were even countless life forms that were pulled into the endless space-time dimension like Luo Fan had been. They were completely melted, assimilated, and turned into a bit of the space-time dimension's power, becoming resources for the growth of the space-time dimension. One could imagine that if Luo Fan had not surpassed himself and condensed the core of his space-time dimension, the fate of many life forms would have been his. Of course, it was impossible for that to happen now. In the boundless space-time dimension ocean, Luo Fan was like a fish swimming towards the depths of the space-time dimension ocean. Everything, including the world and the space-time dimension, had a core. This was something that Luo Fan had already comprehended when he was still on the transcendence path. It was the same for the boundless space-time dimension ocean in front of him. Currently, Luo Fan did not know where the core was. However, he knew that the source of the power and chaos of the entire space-time dimension ocean was very likely where the core was at this moment. The direction he was heading in was the direction where the space-time dimension's chaos was getting stronger and stronger. It was also the direction in which he would find it increasingly difficult to move forward. From the outside, the singularity seemed to have no size, as if it was just a point that did not exist. However, it was boundlessly vast inside. If one really wanted to move in accordance with the movement method of a normal living being, if they could move in it, then it would probably take countless years for them to advance even a tiny bit of distance that Luo Fan was currently moving. Fundamentally speaking, this was even caused by the natural changes in the space-time dimension caused by the passage of time. In this way, one could naturally tell exactly how difficult it was to advance in this place. Luo Fan kept moving forward. He kept moving forward. The increasing resistance in front of him was the best indication to him. It let him know that the direction he was heading in was not wrong. Time. In this space-time dimension ocean, time was completely meaningless. The time that Luo Fan's clone experienced was constantly lengthening. 1 year, 10 years, 100 years. 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 10,000,000 years, 100 trillion years. Such time did not exist for his main body at all. It felt as if the longer and longer time was compressed and exploded in an instant. If it was not for the fact that Luo Fan had the ability to equate an instant with 100 trillion years, his clone would not have been able to experience it for long. He had to let the time flow between his clone and his main body at the same time in order to be able to withstand it. Even so, from his main body's point of view, it took nearly a year before his clone finally arrived at a place where the space-time dimension's power was so strong that it was enough to completely crush him at the beginning. One was the source of the fluctuations, and the other was the source of the chaos in the space-time ocean inside the singularity. In other words, it was the core of the entire singularity. An instant was equivalent to 100 trillion years. Then, how many billions of trillion years was a year? Even Luo Fan did not have the time to analyze it in detail. At this moment, he stood at the source of the fluctuations, enduring the infinitely powerful impact. He felt his space-time dimension being constantly stirred up by the impact. The core of the space-time dimension that he had condensed was constantly being washed away in the process. It continued to condense, forming a mysterious cycle. If Luo Fan had endured such an attack at the beginning, it would have been difficult for him to withstand it. His space-time dimension would have definitely been washed away immediately. However, after experiencing such a long period of tempering, the core of the space-time dimension had already been tempered to the point that it was many times tougher than before. In fact, it could even separate and combine at will. Thus, its ability to withstand the impact had unknowingly risen to an unimaginable level. Therefore, although the impact was terrifying, it could no longer break through his defenses and completely destroy his space-time dimension. From a certain point of view, this was also a great improvement. As he stood in front of the core and looked at the hole that seemed to be connected to an unknown number of dimensions, Luo Fan was completely convinced that this was the place he was looking for. There was a strange aura that was faintly discernible coming from that hole. This aura was insignificant compared to the chaos in the endless space-time dimensions. In fact, any space-time dimension could crush this aura countless times. However, Luo Fan had a vague feeling that this was the aura that had caused the singularity to appear and the endless space-time ocean to appear. However, this was just a feeling. He could not find the profoundness and mysteriousness of this aura at all. It felt like an extremely ordinary aura that was emitted by an extremely ordinary object. This aura was completely different from any existence that Luo Fan had any impression of. When he discovered this situation, Luo Fan could only think of two words: true saint. Only an existence above the true divine stage could have such a performance and cause such a terrifying result. I must break it. Otherwise, an existence that can be summoned by this aura will definitely be able to destroy this world easily. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he activated his spiritual treasure embryo without hesitation. Endless mysterious light erupted from the spiritual treasure embryo. With the help of the mysterious connection, it was directly transmitted to where the clone was. Under the clone's control, it brazenly rushed into the hole. The hole was deep and unfathomable. It seemed to be right in front of him, but in reality, it existed between existence and non-existence. It was on the boundary between what could be touched and what could not be touched. Although the mysterious light of the spiritual treasure embryo was extremely powerful, it could not come into contact with the hole at all. It rushed through the hole, but it did not feel like it had hit anything. Even if it was a phantom, it would definitely react to the impact of the mysterious light. Now that there was such a situation in this real hole, the profoundness of the hole was extremely profound. It went without saying. This situation was beyond his expectations, but it was also reasonable. After all, this was a scene that he suspected was caused by a wisp of aura from a true saint or even an existence above a true saint. Although he had not expected this kind of performance, it was only something he had not expected. This was the normal performance of such an aura. With a slight thought, Luo Fan completely retracted the mysterious light that had missed. At the same time, His own law power was completely stirred at this moment. It suddenly combined with the mysterious light of the spiritual treasure embryo, complementing each other and surging with each other. Gradually, an indescribable change occurred. An extremely powerful aura was released from it and began to impact the extremely chaotic space-time dimension around it. It collided with the power produced by the space-time dimension, causing an earth-shattering sound and light effect. This aura was even thousands of times stronger than Luo Fan's own aura. It had almost turned into an attack that could destroy the world. Such an aura could be said to have formed two completely opposite extremes from the aura that came from the whole. Along with this aura, the indescribable existence formed by the mysterious light and the power of laws brazenly charged into the whole, bringing with it a murderous aura that could destroy the heavens and the earth, bringing with it a conviction that could completely destroy any existence as it charged into the whole. This time, the whole finally did not seem to be completely non-existent. An extremely intense impact erupted from the whole. The powerful impact directly shattered the endless space-time dimension around it, causing the originally chaotic space-time dimension to suddenly disappear completely. All of a sudden, it completely disappeared, turning this place into a void that didn't even have a space-time dimension. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an endless and terrifying power bombarding his body. His doppelganger was silent and had completely collapsed. Even the concept of his doppelganger's existence was constantly being melted away. It felt like ice and snow had returned to the sun. At this moment, Luo Fan's main body did not dare to be negligent. His concept of existence was stimulated to the maximum, and he tried his best to make up for the loss of the doppelganger's existence. The doppelganger was derived from the main body, so its concept of existence was naturally derived from the main body's concept of existence. Under such circumstances, the damage to the doppelganger's concept of existence would naturally be able to be compensated by the main body's concept of existence. This kind of eruption was endless and incessant, causing the concept of existence of Luo Fan's doppelganger to be continuously weakened. His main body had no choice but to go all out to support it. When everything calmed down, Luo Fan's doppelganger began to condense again. It appeared in front of the whole. At this moment, the whole had also undergone a huge change. The aura that came from the whole still existed, but it seemed to have been separated by a layer. It was as if there was an additional layer of strange barrier between heaven and earth and that aura. However, this was only temporary. As the aura melted away, the layer of barrier was rapidly weakening. It looked like it was about to disappear completely, causing the aura to once again descend on the singularity and the location where Luo Fan's doppelganger was. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan knew that he definitely could not let that aura descend again. After all, once it descended, it would mean that all his previous efforts would have been in vain. When he thought of this, he no longer cared about where the barrier came from. Boundless power suddenly poured into the barrier that was revealed because of the aura. He continuously strengthened the barrier and did his best to make up for the weakening of the barrier by the aura. For the current Luo Fan, it was naturally impossible for him to directly resist that aura. However, just like how activating a machine to do something was much easier than directly replacing that machine to do something, helping the barrier replenish itself and letting the barrier deal with that aura was much easier than dealing with that aura himself. Therefore, his plan had succeeded. Under his efforts, the barrier did not continuously weaken under the aura. Instead, it continued to thicken under the replenishment of his law power and the spirit light of the spirit treasure embryo. However, the speed was rather slow. As the singularity was isolated from the aura, it began to gradually disappear. After an unknown period of time, it completely collapsed, allowing Luo Fan's doppelganger to reappear in this world and appear in a place far away from his main body. As the singularity disappeared, the endless waves that were released from the singularity also gradually consumed the power it contained. all the waves began to gradually calm down. In just a few years, they had completely disappeared, as if they had never appeared in the first place. The appearance of this situation meant that, at least for the time being, the crisis that this world was about to encounter had disappeared. When the waves completely disappeared, the power of the mysterious power that Luo Fan had triggered also began to be withdrawn. At this moment, a strange rumble sounded between heaven and earth. Chapter 1958. It's done. In that instant, Luo Fan's eyes lit up and his spirit became unprecedentedly focused. He carefully observed all the changes in the two imprints and experienced all the characteristics that he could understand. However, at this moment, the mysterious mark in Hun Ku's and Empty Lady's minds suddenly collapsed, turning into endless information that burst out and gradually dissipated in the process. Although the entire process was a huge blow to Hun Ku and Empyrean, who were in an alternate timeline, to the point that they felt as if their souls were about to crumble under the impact, it helped their souls break free from the shackles, allowing them to gain true freedom and regain their original autonomy. In such a situation, the two of them naturally felt an indescribable joy amidst the endless pain, as though they had been reborn. We're finally free. Similar voices came from the mouths of Space Maiden and Hun Ku in different timelines one after another. With this sound, both of their bodies suddenly collapsed. The resulting impact directly pushed the already chaotic depths of the starry sky even more chaotic. Countless fine wisps of smoke drifted in all directions, gradually turning into nothingness. Luo Fan wasn't the least bit worried about this change that seemed to have completely disappeared. The smile on his face didn't diminish and was still the same as before. In the next instant, countless smoke condensed again. Not long after, the figures of two peerless beauties condensed in front of him. They were Hun Ku and Empty Lady, a different timeline. Compared to back then, both of their faces were a little pale. However, their eyes had become increasingly deep. It was as though they had already comprehended some kind of extremely crucial principle. Seeing them like this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "Go. What you need now is to comprehend what you've obtained before. As for other matters, we'll talk about them after you've comprehended them." Hearing this, the two of them looked at each other. They bowed to Luo Fan, turned around, and took light steps, disappearing before Luo Fan. Needless to say, Hun Ku returned to her heavenly emperor position, which was the heavenly court. On the other hand, Empty Lady, a different timeline, directly disappeared from this world. She directly stepped onto the platform enveloped by the mysterious power. She chose the safest and most mysterious place to cultivate in seclusion. Seeing them leave, Luo Fan shook his head and smiled. With a thought, his figure gradually became blurry. Not long after, he disappeared from the range of all living beings' senses. As he disappeared, the mysterious power fluctuated and the chaos in the starry sky instantly calmed down. In just a few breaths of time, it had completely returned to its original state. It had completely returned to its original state, as if all the conflicts and chaos from before had never happened. In such a situation, it was obvious that Luo Fan had used the power of that power to completely restore everything here. At this moment, although Luo Fan had completely disappeared from everyone's eyes, he still didn't leave. However, in reality, he did not leave this place. Instead, he went straight to the location of the singularity. Just like the singularity from back then, he sat in the void and firmly suppressed all possible changes that might occur. The singularity had appeared here and not somewhere else. This clearly meant that this location was very special. At the very least, it was very suitable for the singularity to appear. That was the only way to explain why the singularity had appeared here and not in any other region in this world. For other living beings, such a location would naturally be extremely dangerous. It was naturally incomparably dangerous. The slightest bit of carelessness would cause one to turn into that singularity or something similar, and then die a violent death, turning into nothingness. However, this was clearly not the case for Luo Fan. After all, he was an existence that could strengthen his unique space-time dimension to the point that it could contend with the space-time dimension in the singularity. To him, even if the singularity appeared here, it would not be enough to shake his existence. Instead, the impact caused by his unique space-time dimension would cause the singularity to collapse on its own. It would not be able to take shape at all. If even the singularity was in such a state, then other existences that were slightly weaker than the singularity would naturally not be a threat to him. Hence, he was clearly relatively safe here. On the contrary, due to the mystical nature of this location, it was very likely that Luo Fan's space-time dimension would be tempered due to the mystical nature of this location. This would also allow the various comprehensions he had obtained from the singularity to be sorted out once again. In turn, it would more or less bring him some benefits. As Luo Fan sat in this place, there were no changes at first. This place was like an extremely ordinary starry sky. As he sat there, it was as if he was directly floating in the depths of the void. He did not feel any abnormalities at all, let alone receive any tempering. However, as time passed, he gradually sensed that the surrounding time, space, matter, energy, and even the nomological laws started to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. An incomparably mysterious power began to take effect on his body. Indistinctly, it wanted to affect his space-time dimension, wanting to change the various attributes of his existence. It's here. At this moment, this thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. As he opened his eyes, there seemed to be two deep and unfathomable black holes in his eyes. They seemed to be constantly swallowing everything, all mysteries and principles. At this moment, he looked at his surroundings, and the perspective in his eyes changed slightly. It was as if a strange barrier had suddenly appeared in front of him, isolating him from the surrounding world. When he looked at himself again, he discovered that his unique space-time dimension had unknowingly begun to tremble subtly. It seemed to be in a state where it was about to be activated, but it had yet to be activated. However, this was not happening under his control. How could he not understand this situation? This was clearly the effect of the mystical nature of this location, and it was currently making some sort of indescribable change to him. His heart stirred slightly. Luo Fan turned around and looked behind him. In other words, beyond this world, beyond the starry sky. He looked over. As he looked over, he discovered that the originally incomparably deep barrier that separated heaven and earth from the state of primal chaos had suddenly shrunk a little. It seemed that the state of primal chaos had become much clearer than before. Vaguely, he felt that there was an indescribable and terrifying existence behind the state of primal chaos that was producing an indescribable resonance with him. This resonance was so profound that he even felt as if he was gradually being controlled by it, gradually becoming a part of the existence that was resonating with him. It seems that he really hasn't given up. Sensing all these changes, Luo Fan already understood. He couldn't help but sigh. Even if this special location in the depths of the starry sky contained all sorts of indescribable mysteries, it wasn't enough to cause such a change in Luo Fan. After all, Luo Fan was a powerful existence that had already passed the third Great Tribulation, and he could even faintly sense that he was about to pass the fourth Great Tribulation. Such an existence wasn't something that could be affected or shaken by the world. Not to mention that only a few hundred years had passed, even trillions of years, or even hundreds of trillions of years, wouldn't cause such a change in him. But now, such a change had actually occurred here. There was obviously only one possibility. There was an external force that was helping this place to influence him. Moreover, this external force, it was definitely countless times stronger than Luo Fan. Only in this way could it cause such a change in Luo Fan in such a short period of time. No matter how he thought about it, the only thing that had the strength and motive to act as such an external force was outside this world. The owner of that aura that was separated by an unknown amount of space, all sorts of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. In an instant, he had already made a decision. He narrowed his eyes slightly and directly activated the strange power. In an instant, a wave of power was transmitted to his body, and it started to surge and brew in his body. Then, indescribable fluctuations were released from his body. These fluctuations weren't much different from the fluctuations emitted by the singularity back then. They were similarly mysterious and profound, and contained endless mysteries. However, in terms of appearance, they were almost the complete opposite of the fluctuations emitted by the singularity back then. The fluctuations emitted by the singularity back then had been summoning some sort of existence to descend. But now, the fluctuations emitted by the singularity were extremely strong and repelling some sort of existence. Given Luo Fan's current level, it was extremely difficult for him to send these fluctuations out of the world. Trying to penetrate the state of chaos was even more difficult, and it was almost impossible. However, one mustn't forget that he had the help of that strange power. That strange power had transcended the world, and it was even able to continuously gather the fragments of the world in the state of chaos. It went without saying how high its level was. With its help, Luo Fan had already turned the impossible into the possible. However, he had easily sent his ripples out, penetrating the state of primal chaos and beyond the world, towards the depths of the state of primal chaos, towards the existence that was still faintly affecting him. This was because the distance between him and that existence was simply too great. Furthermore, that existence far exceeded the scope of Luo Fan's understanding. Therefore, even though the fluctuations had been released by his body, he had no idea what the results would be. It was even more impossible for him to know how that existence would react after sensing his fluctuations. The only thing he could be sure of was that as the fluctuations spread out, the changes that the environment in the depths of the starry sky had on him had completely stopped. Although it hadn't completely disappeared, it was already many times better than it had been before. This was also the source of Luo Fan's confidence. It allowed him to clearly know that his decision wasn't completely useless. In this manner, time gradually flowed. Unknowingly, thousands of years had already passed. Over these thousands of years, Luo Fan had always been hovering in the same position, carefully sensing the changes in his body, and absorbing the various faintly discernible principles that he had observed when he first broke the two imprints. Because of the changes that the surrounding environment had on him, it was much easier for him to comprehend the various faintly discernible principles than usual. In just a short few thousand years, he had already gained a lot. Although he still couldn't completely understand what that existence was like. However, the basic concept had already been established. In the end, it had already been established. That existence wasn't a true saint. This was the same as what he had felt when he first sensed the imprint. However, that existence was definitely not weaker than a true saint in terms of level. To put it in a more accurate way, compared to a true saint, it was more like two different paths that led to the same level. It was highly possible that even though that existence possessed unparalleled might and countless methods, it was still inferior to a true saint in certain aspects. For example, if a true saint discovered this world, the chaotic state wouldn't be a problem for him. It would be a piece of cake for him to invade this world, and he wouldn't need to rely on any singularities at all. What was the summoning, what was the method, and what was the channel to achieve this goal? Of course, that existence might have other advantages over a true saint. However, this wasn't something that the current Luo Fan could know. After all, for the current Luo Fan, he didn't know what the real limits were, and he didn't know to what extent that existence could achieve. He also didn't know how it was possible to measure how superior it was to a true saint. Through thousands of years of deduction and sensing, guessing, Luo Fan vaguely guessed that the cultivation path of that existence was very likely to be related to predestined tribulations. However, that was all there was to it. After thousands of years, there was such a huge difference in level. Being able to obtain all this was already considered his ability to be extremely heaven-defying. Wanting more was just wishful thinking. Just as Luo Fan was secretly comprehending all these, an indescribable shock appeared on his body one day. Immediately after, the repulsive wave that he emitted completely collapsed in an instant. As it collapsed, the changes that the surrounding environment had on him disappeared in an instant, as if it had never appeared. His body had completely returned to its normal state. As he returned to this state, the source that caused him to emit the wave naturally disappeared completely. As he could no longer sense the existence of that path, the power of that strange power also lost its direction. In an instant, it had already returned to its main body and disappeared completely, as if it had never appeared. That existence has given up on this world? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. When this thought surfaced, the only thing he felt was disbelief. After all, that existence was an existence that was comparable to a true saint. Such an existence was many times stronger than him. Would it really retreat because of this method of mine? Would it just give up on this perfect world that was highly likely to be upgraded to the great world level? With a slight thought, he used all his means to thoroughly investigate himself, wanting to find the possible hidden dangers. However, no matter how thoroughly he investigated, he found that there were no hidden dangers at all. His entire body was so perfect, so clear. Has it really given up completely? Luo Fan was still somewhat in disbelief in the end, after even activating the power of that strange power and using this power to thoroughly investigate his entire body. He had to admit that that existence had really given up on this world. How could it be so simple? Luo Fan sighed. He was originally prepared to wait here for millions of years, or even tens of millions of years. However, he did not expect that this time it would be so anticlimactic. He had only used the first method to deal with it, and the other party had actually given up. It was like two people were playing chess, and one of them had already calculated 30 or 40 moves, thinking that they might be able to draw in the end. However, he did not expect that the other party would immediately send the old general up, and the first move would be a checkmate. That was how Luo Fan felt at the moment. After thinking about it for a long time, he barely came up with an explanation. Perhaps, for that existence, this world is just an arrangement to pass time. Now that it feels that there is some resistance here, it's too troublesome to use it to pass time, and the gains do not make up for the losses, so it gave up. This explanation naturally did not make much sense, but it was the best explanation that Luo Fan could think of now. As he sighed inwardly, he could only let go of this matter and slowly stood up. At this moment, the sense of crisis that had been accumulating in his heart had completely dissipated. At this moment, he had completely recovered to his peak, and his entire body felt comfortable all over. He even vaguely felt that the feeling of the fourth great calamity seemed to have become slightly clearer. At the same time, a loud rumbling sound began to ring out in this part of the world. "Thank you." Luo Fan actually easily heard the two words in this voice. Chapter 1959. Another 1,000 years had passed since the last time he received the thanks of the will of the world. After such a long time, this world had completely recovered from the great calamity. Currently, the three realms were in good order. The heavenly realm and the heavenly court had already been completely restored at some point in time. As for the various losses suffered by the cultivation world, while it was impossible for them to completely recover so quickly, they were still much stronger than before. One could imagine that with enough time, the cultivation world would definitely be able to recover completely. All that was left was a matter of time. Over the years, Air Maiden and Hun Ku, who were in different timelines, did not appear in front of Luo Fan. Instead, he had been cultivating in seclusion in his own place. There was naturally no need to say much about Sky Maiden, who was in a different timeline. She was outside the world, so all the changes she caused would naturally only take effect outside the world and would not be sensed by any living beings inside the world. Thus, there had been no news of any activity in the past few years. In comparison, Hun-Ku was different. She was in this world, in the heaven realm, in the heavenly court. It could be considered the center of this world. Any commotion caused by his seclusion would be exposed in a manner that was thousands of times greater than what it should have been. The result of this was that some kind of indescribable light would appear from time to time from where she was cultivating, causing the light in this world to undergo some kind of indescribable change, manifesting its powerful presence to all existences in this world. This also allowed the living beings in this world to sense her existence even more. As a result, their confidence in this world grew even stronger. After all, the celestial Dharch was the greatest representative of this world. The celestial emperor was powerful. This meant that this world's ability to withstand misfortune and other abnormal changes would be greatly enhanced. In fact, the reason why this world had recovered so well over the past few years was because of the natural environment. It was also because of the huge commotion caused by Hun-Ku's closed-door cultivation. Compared to them, Luo Fan did not leave. Instead, he stayed in the depths of the starry sky and quietly comprehended the various gains he had gained after coming into contact with a powerful existence that was comparable to a true sage. For the current him, there wasn't much of a difference where one cultivated. Unless a powerful existence's power or traces were involved, this situation would not change. So, cultivating in the depths of the starry sky wasn't much different from cultivating in an abode of his own somewhere else. That was why he still chose to cultivate here even after that existence had completely given up, instead of leaving this place and choosing another mysterious place to comprehend something. Over the years, he had dug deep into his own body. After carefully comprehending it, although his understanding of that existence had improved a little, it was completely insignificant. In fact, he couldn't even tell if this insignificant improvement was real or fake. In the end, it's still too far away. On this day, Luo Fan sighed, stood up, and turned to look at the place where he had been cultivating for thousands of years. Here, because of his existence, because of the influence of his own power, because of the influence of his own existence compared to before, there had already been a significant change. Vaguely, there seemed to be an invisible star that was about to be born here. This wasn't strange. Back then, that wisp of aura could easily form a singularity that could even threaten the entire world. Although Luo Fan was far inferior to that aura in every aspect, he was also a powerful existence that had already passed the third great tribulation. However, he already possessed the characteristics that only that aura possessed. In other words, it had a great influence on the surrounding environment. Although it had only been a few thousand years, the surrounding laws were already slightly biased because of his existence. The endless essence of the stars had unknowingly started to gather at this location in a special way. Gradually, the embryonic form of a star was formed. Because this star was formed under Luo Fan's influence, its existence already had many of his imprints. It could even be said that it was some kind of projection of Luo Fan in this starry sky. Of course, this was the case if this continued to develop. Once Luo Fan left, the star would continue to form, but the imprints that belonged to Luo Fan would eventually be diluted by the laws of this world. In the end, it would turn into a star that had some of Luo Fan's characteristics, but was more like a normal star. After glancing at the star that was about to form, Luo Fan had no intention of staying here any longer. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. With a flash, he had already left this world with the help of the mysterious power. He arrived outside this world, on the platform that was enveloped by the power. When he arrived, he saw Sky Lady sitting cross-legged on the platform in a different timeline. Light shone around her, and countless runes were faintly discernible. They were constantly changing in a way that even Luo Fan couldn't distinguish. At this moment, she sensed Luo Fan's arrival. Her body trembled, and the countless runes slowly retracted. Not long after, they had retracted back into her body. In the blink of an eye, nothing unusual could be seen. At this moment she opened her eyes and said, "You've come at the right time. I was about to bid you farewell." Hearing this, Luo Fan was surprised at first, but he soon nodded in realization. "I see. Looks like you want to return to Earth." "That's right. Now that I've found a way to return to my timeline, if I don't go there, I'm afraid I'll completely forget about that timeline." Air Maiden sighed in the alternate timeline. At this moment, she had already stood up and stood gracefully in front of Luo Fan. There was a hint of fear in her eyes, as well as a faint sense of loss. Seeing this, Luo Fan could only sigh and say, "Up to you. However, you'd better not stay in that timeline for too long." Sky Lady was slightly taken aback and said, "Why?" She had originally planned to spread her Tao techniques in that timeline. This would make that timeline, which was originally ordinary among the countless timelines, stand out and eventually become the main one, becoming the orthodox direction of the development of Earth's universe. And this would obviously take up a lot of time. Under such circumstances, it would take a lot of time. Suddenly hearing Luo Fan's words, how could she not be surprised? Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head and said with a smile, "Have you forgotten where I came from?" "You are." Sky Lady was even more taken aback. Previously, Luo Fan had indeed talked to her about this. However, the content of the conversation was rather ordinary and there was nothing special about it. Could it really be related to this? However, after all, she was an existence that could be mentioned in the same breath as Luo Fan before he had gone through 3 major tribulations. Soon, he understood Luo Fan's meaning, and his complexion couldn't help but change. Yes, those true saints are obviously plotting something. The future of Earth's universe is very likely to disappear. It is twisted to a completely different direction. Naturally, it is impossible for my timeline to be preserved. If that true saint completely reverses the future and I am in that timeline, won't I be completely eliminated? Her expression turned ugly. At this time, Luo Fan just nodded and said nothing. As a matter of fact, there was nothing much to say. The timeline of Space Maiden in a different timeline would almost certainly be eliminated. The timeline that he was in would be the one that he was in. Wasn't it the same? Even the countless futures that had developed after Earth's universe was broken were very likely to completely disappear because of the actions of that true saint. Under such circumstances, what else could he say to Sky Lady? Under such circumstances, what else could he say to Sky Lady in a different timeline? At most, all he could do was give a reminder like that. Originally, I thought that I would be able to make that timeline stand out once I found a way. I didn't expect that everything would be like a flower in the fog and the moon in the water. Sky Lady in a different timeline sighed. Seeing her like this, Luo Fan knew that she had not given up on the idea of going to the timeline where Earth's universe was. However, he could only sigh and say no more. Just as Sky Lady in a different timeline was about to take action, she suddenly thought of something. She turned to look at Luo Fan and asked, "I'm leaving now. Are you not willing to let me meet her?" Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "She is in seclusion. It is not good to disturb her at this time." Of course, he knew that Sky Lady in a different timeline was referring to Sky Lady. At this time, there was no need to ask any nonsense questions like who she was. He directly gave his answer. Hearing this, Sky Lady in a different timeline could not help but feel very regretful. She said, "That's really a pity. I really want to see what the woman that you like looks like." Luo Fan just smiled and said nothing. No matter how he answered this, it would be wrong. If he answered too much, it would become teasing, but if he answered too little, it would be completely meaningless. Sky Lady in a different timeline did not wait for Luo Fan to answer. After saying that, she began to activate the inexplicable power contained in this strange power based on her various comprehensions on this platform over the years. As the power contained in this power was activated, her body gradually began to emit an inexplicable light. This light was as bright as snow, giving off an extremely holy feeling. It was like a white lotus in the wind and snow. In this bright white light, Luo Fan felt that the summoning formation he had left in the higher space-time dimension of Earth's universe was trembling slightly, as if it had been agitated by some indescribable power. However, it was clear that the indescribable power was not directly connected to this formation. It was only affected by the formation's connection on a certain level. Soon, the trembling completely disappeared. Although this power could communicate with Earth's universe, it was clearly countless times more difficult than communicating with each other among the countless fragments of the universe. At this moment, the lustrous white light emanating from Space Lady in the alternate timeline grew brighter and more intense. Under this sparkling white light, even the entire platform trembled slightly, as if this force had exhausted all of its strength. Given how powerful this power was, Sky Lady in a different timeline had to put in a lot of effort to achieve this. It could even be said that she could not achieve this with her own strength. At this moment, the reason why she was able to do this was because she had already obtained what she had. That indescribable stone had already been taken out, and it had even been activated. At this moment, a figure appeared on this platform out of nowhere. It was Hun Ku. "Mom, are you leaving me?" Hun Ku cried out anxiously as soon as she appeared. Clearly, although she was cultivating in seclusion in the heavenly court, she could still sense the outside world. She, who was also connected to this energy, could also sense the intense change that had occurred in this energy. Combined with some indescribable premonition, she could naturally guess that her mother was going to do something that she did not want to see. Sky Lady in a different timeline turned around and smiled. "Don't worry, I'm just going home to take a look. I'll be back soon." How could Hun Ku be dismissed with just one sentence? She immediately said, "Mom's home is also my home. I want to go too." With that, she said, she was going to use her connection with this power to activate the power's might and join Sky Lady in a different timeline to head to Earth's universe. As she moved, the entire platform shook even more violently. It even gave off a feeling that it would completely collapse in the next moment, throwing all the living beings on the platform into the boundless state of chaos around them. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed. With a wave of his hand, Hun Ku's connection with this power was instantly cut off. Her influence on the might of this power. Naturally, it had completely disappeared. The intense shaking of the platform caused by her participation had also completely subsided because of this. At this moment, the woman from the alternate timeline, whose eyes were filled with anxiety and shock, heaved a sigh of relief. Without waiting for her to say anything, her figure flashed and completely turned into an afterimage. Her real body had already disappeared without a trace. "Mom! Daddy, why are you stopping me?" Hun Ku shouted. "Don't be so rash. If I didn't stop you just now, you would have missed the important matter." Luo Fan sighed. He wasn't being an alarmist. If he had allowed Hun Ku's behavior to continue, in that case, the empty girl's plan would completely fail. It had to be known that Empyrean, who was in a different timeline, had borrowed this power and the treasure that she had obtained by chance that almost surpassed a primordial origin spiritual treasure. Only then could she barely connect to the Earth universe and the timeline where she was born. In other words, it was already extremely difficult for her to achieve this step. In such a situation, Hun Ku's sudden intervention would directly break this balance, directly making all the previous efforts of the empty girl in a different timeline go to waste. If she had allowed this to continue, not to mention that the empty girl in a different timeline would not be able to return to her own timeline in the Earth universe. If she was not careful, her body might collapse due to the backlash and be directly twisted into powder. Even the concept of her own existence would be completely eliminated. After all, Hun Ku was a supreme emperor-level cultivator and also a celestial sovereign of that world. There was no need to say more about her cultivation and her knowledge. The reason why she didn't think of the danger just now was that she was momentarily agitated and couldn't think calmly. Now that she was reminded by Luo Fan, she had completely calmed down and instantly knew what her behavior meant. Cold sweat instantly dripped down her face. "I almost killed Mom." A feeling of extreme lingering fear caused her expression to change unpredictably. Seeing her like this, Luo Fan knew that she had already understood. He just smiled and said, "Don't worry, with me here, everything will be fine." Hearing this, Hun Ku's expression didn't improve much. Although she believed that with Luo Fan around, it was unlikely that her mother would suffer too much damage because of this. However, this didn't eliminate the danger of her previous actions. It didn't mean that her previous actions were completely correct. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that no matter how he tried to persuade her, it would not be effective, so he faintly smiled and said, "If you have any guilt, you can explain it to her later. I think it won't be long before she returns." Hearing this, Hun Ku's eyes lit up. "Mom will be back soon? Didn't you say that that place is very far from here? Moreover, she hasn't been back for a long time, so she will stay there for a little longer no matter what. There is a state of chaos between here and her hometown. With chaos as a barrier, the time between them is naturally independent. The time she stays there may be extremely long for her. But for us, it may only be a moment," Luo Fan said with a smile. Hun Ku's eyes lit up. "That's great, I will wait here for her to come back." Chapter 1960. While Hun Ku was waiting, Luo Fan was not interested in waiting any longer. With just a greeting, he used the power of this strange force to directly choose one of the countless large fragments of the world and directly entered it, beginning a new round of his journey. He had been preparing for a long time to travel between the fragments of the great world. It was just that there had been all sorts of problems that had disrupted his plans, forcing him to run all over the place. It was only now that he finally found an opportunity to carry out this plan. The fragments of the world were fragments of the larger world. Even though they had developed their own mysteries after such a long period of time, such as transforming into a perfect world or directly turning into a chaotic planet that revolved in a chaotic state, the essence of the larger world fragment still existed. If he carefully comprehended it, he would naturally be able to comprehend some of the mysteries of the large world, which would be extremely beneficial for him to increase his knowledge and accumulate comprehension. Just as he had expected, the time taken for the Space Maiden from the alternate timeline to return from her own timeline was relatively long. At least, it was so compared to Hun Ku's own perception of time. Luo Fan had traveled to more than 100 world fragments, and he had even watched a dozen of them collide with that side of the world and be completely devoured by that world. More than 3 million years had passed, but the Space Maiden from the alternate timeline still had not returned. Hun Ku was still anxiously waiting on the platform. To Hun Ku, this was undoubtedly a form of cruelty. However, it was also a form of tempering for him. In this almost hopeless wait, her mood initially became more and more irritated as time passed, even to the point of almost going crazy. However, as time continued to pass, this irritability and even madness gradually passed. Instead, she became calm again. This kind of change from madness to calmness was a great tempering for her temperament, causing her mind to become more and more mature. Her mind was also improved after that. After waiting for a period of time for the Space Maiden from the alternate timeline to return, she naturally fell into irritation and madness again, starting another cycle, and so on. Annoyance, madness, and calmness came one after another. It was like a whetstone that continuously sharpened his spirit, causing his spirit to continuously strengthen, causing his cultivation to become more and more stable. There were even faint signs of a breakthrough brewing within him. Hunku's emotions would only fluctuate so much if it was related to Space Maiden from a different timeline. Otherwise, no matter what, Hunku was a heavenly emperor, and his cultivation had even reached the level of a supreme emperor. How could he possibly be unable to hold on for a short few million years? On this day, Luo Fan, who was observing the operation of a certain chaos planet, felt his heart skip a beat. He vaguely sensed something and immediately stopped what he was doing. He activated the strange power and took a step forward, disappearing from the chaos planet in the blink of an eye. When he reappeared, he was already floating on the platform. At this moment, Hunk was sitting cross-legged in a corner of the platform. Looking at the steady and calm temperament that lingered around her body, it was already much better than before. Sensing Luo Fan's arrival, Hunku's heart skipped a beat, and she suddenly opened her eyes. When she saw Luo Fan standing not far away from her, an inexplicable surprise suddenly appeared on her face. An indescribable look of pleasant surprise suddenly appeared on his face as he said, "Father, Daddy, is Mommy coming back?" Luo Fan smiled and said, "If my hunch is right, it should be so." Hearing this, Hunku jumped up. Her previous calm temperament was nowhere to be seen. Her entire expression was filled with endless excitement and anticipation. Luo Fan did not say much at this moment. He just woke up and sensed the changes in the mysterious power, feeling if there was something that was crossing space and coming over. Millions of years had passed, but Luo Fan's understanding of this power had not improved much. It was still the same as before. At this time, although he was meditating, he still didn't understand anything. That power was still as stable as before. That possibility existed. The existence that was crossing space and coming over could not be sensed at all. While he was in the process of sensing it, this power suddenly started to fluctuate slightly. As the ripples spread out, a figure appeared from nothing, materialized, and gradually appeared on the platform. The moment she saw this figure, Hunku could not help but be pleasantly surprised. There was no other reason than that this person was Sky Maiden from a different timeline. But soon, Hunku's expression became a little unsightly. Because she found that Sky Maiden from a different timeline was not the same as before. Instead, she was in an extremely sorry state. She felt as if she had gone through countless battles and had no time to recover before rushing over. At this moment, Luo Fan also frowned. He was also extremely surprised by the changes that had happened to Sky Maiden from a different timeline. Normally speaking, in the Earth universe after the world was shattered and during the Age of Chaos, Connate Zenith Heaven cultivators were considered to be close to the peak. The Sage-to-Be realm was the limit of cultivators. In such an era, even a false sage could be absolutely invincible, let alone Sky Maiden from a different timeline who had surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm. It was impossible for anything or any existence to have an impression of him. Under such a background, Sky Maiden from a different timeline was in such a sorry state, as if she had gone through a terrible battle. How could he not be curious about this situation? Soon enough, the Space Maiden from a different timeline was revealed to the world. Seeing both Luo Fan and Hunku by her side, she could not help but be overjoyed. She said, "It's good that you're here. Hurry up and come with me. There are powerful enemies in the Earth universe. I can't deal with them alone." Hearing this, Luo Fan hurriedly stopped Hunku, who was about to take action. He said, slow down. Now that we are no longer in the Earth universe, the time there is already relatively independent from here. How long have we been delayed here? None of that will affect the time it takes us to get there. So, you'd better explain things clearly first." Hearing this, the air hostess in the alternate timeline still looked anxious and said, "It's different this time. The enemy this time is from chaos. We don't lack this bit of time." Luo Fan still shook his head and said, "Was this a joke? He didn't know anything and just rushed over like that. Was he waiting to die or what? If the opponent was as powerful as that wisp of aura that he encountered back then, wouldn't he just be sending himself to the door and be easily taken care of by the opponent? The Empyrean maiden in a different timeline saw this. He knew that if Luo Fan didn't know the situation, he would never agree. He could only sigh and tell him the situation. It turned out that when she returned to the Earth universe in her timeline, she discovered that the situation in the Earth universe was no different from when she had left. There were still billions of years until the next era shift, as if time had not passed at all after she had left. She discovered this. Naturally, she felt as if it was a lifetime ago. If it wasn't for her firm mind, she would almost suspect that everything she had experienced in the other world over the years was just an illusion. After that, she began to carry out her plan. She began to preach on Earth and across the universe. She took in thousands of disciples, set up countless secret realms, and opened up countless places for cultivators to cultivate in. She sent all the living beings in the universe who had the aptitude to cultivate into it, and so on and so forth. In just a short period of tens of millions of years, the cultivation level of the Earth universe in that timeline had increased by several levels. Originally, the innate Grand Luo was already the peak. After tens of millions of years, the innate Grand Luo had already become the middle level of the cultivators. Only those in the demi-saint realm could shake them. The strongest existence had even been promoted to the height of the pseudo-saint realm. Because of this kind of promotion, it was no longer appropriate to call that era the age of Dharma ending. Therefore, under the will of the Empyrean from a different timeline, that era was transformed into a brand new era, an era called the Rune Era. The word rune was obviously named after the Tao that the Empyrean from a different timeline cultivated. At that time, the Great Tribulation of the Changing Era had descended on the Earth universe. Almost 30% of the stars and 30% of the living beings in the Earth universe had been completely annihilated. As a result, the Empyrean from a different timeline had to spend a lot of effort to hold on. When she told Luo Fan about it, the Empyrean from a different timeline admitted that if it wasn't for the experience of resisting the Great Tribulation with Luo Fan, she would not have been able to hold on during the Great Tribulation of the Changing Era. In the end, the reincarnation of the era would descend ahead of time, and the age of Dharma ending would disappear. However, it was not without its benefits to get through the Great Tribulation of the Changing Era with great difficulty. At the very least, after the Great Tribulation of the Changing Era, the entire Earth universe began to change. The rejection of cultivators had completely disappeared. The cultivators who cultivated the Tao of Runes received a great boost. In the universe after that, their cultivation speed was several times faster than before. Due to this change, the 30% of the Earth universe that had been lost was quickly made up for with the efforts of many cultivators. Moreover, because the Earth universe was rebuilt from ruins, the recovered planets and living beings were much stronger than before. At the very least, in terms of adapting to cultivation, they were much better than before. Tens of millions of years later, the cultivation world of the Earth universe continued to develop at a speed that was several times stronger than before. Pseudo-sage cultivators continued to emerge like mushrooms after the rain. As the standards of many cultivators continued to rise, the situation of the entire Earth universe changed more and more. The originally barren universe was gradually filled with stronger and stronger vitality. Due to that vitality, countless powerful living beings were born in the void and gave birth to many races in the starry sky. This made the Earth universe completely different from what Luo Fan remembered. Instead, it was more like a universe from fantasy and legends. Just as everything was developing extremely smoothly, the situation changed. After billions of years, when this era was about to end in a few 100 million years, finally, a cultivator broke through one boundary after another and finally began to break through to the pseudo-sage realm. This was a milestone event in the cultivation world. The Air Maiden, who was in a different timeline, was naturally extremely concerned. At that time, she even specially took action to protect this cultivator so that this cultivator could improve more smoothly. Originally, she had thought that, with her own strength, helping a cultivator break through to the pseudosage realm should be as simple as saying a few words, and there would definitely not be any problems. Therefore, although she seemed to take it very seriously, she was actually not worried at all that there would be any problems with the other party's breakthrough. However, she did not expect that a problem would still appear in the end. Moreover, as soon as it appeared, it was in an earth-shattering manner, making her feel overwhelmed. This was because the process of that cultivator breaking through to the pseudosage realm actually triggered a tribulation. It was something that the air maiden of a different timeline had never encountered or even heard of before. The pseudosage tribulation. That tribulation almost affected the entire Earth and the universe. At that time, the entire universe fell into that sea of lightning, constantly being bombarded by the lightning and continuously destroyed. If it wasn't for Space Maiden, who was in an alternate timeline, protecting the entire universe, the tribulation itself might have been enough to annihilate the entire universe, killing all the cultivators within it. Such a terrifying tribulation. The cultivator who originally had a high chance of breaking through to the pseudosage realm was ultimately unable to make it through. In that tribulation, he turned into dust, leaving no trace of his existence behind. He had been completely erased from this world. As that living being was erased, the entire universe fell into a strange atmosphere. A feeling of despair gradually spread. Which cultivator in the universe could have enough confidence to resist such a terrifying tribulation? Which cultivator felt that they could withstand the terrifying blow and break through to the pseudosage realm? Since they didn't have such confidence, didn't that mean that the cultivation of all cultivators was a dead end? It was simply a dead end. The more one cultivated, the closer one was to death. With this kind of thinking, it was only natural that despair would arise. When Luo Fan heard this, he interrupted. That should be the tide of the era. That era, even after your changes, is not the false saint era, but the rune era. For those cultivators to be able to break through to the false sage stage, they must have already found their own Tao and not the Tao of runes. It would be strange if such a breakthrough didn't trigger a backlash from the tides of the era. Hearing this, the empty lady in the alternate timeline sighed and said, "I've figured it out after that, but it was already too late." Luo Fan nodded. He already had some guesses in his heart. However, this was only a guess. As for the specifics, he still had to wait for confirmation. What the air hostess said next from a different timeline verified his guess. Although that tribulation had subsided after the death of the cultivator, it was still not enough. It caused some indescribable changes to the entire Earth's universe, causing the entire Earth's universe to seem to have reached its doomsday in advance. All kinds of indescribable disasters kept erupting everywhere in the universe, causing the entire Earth's universe to become riddled with holes in an extremely short period of time, as if it had already become extremely broken. Those various situations made the air hostess in the alternate timeline wonder if the reincarnation of the era was coming in advance. She couldn't help but feel anxious and began to look for various ways to eliminate the various disasters, stabilize this world, and work hard to delay the arrival of the tides of the era. This kind of effort couldn't be said to be ineffective, but it could only be described as not very effective. Speaking of this, the air hostess in the alternate timeline felt an inexplicable sense of helplessness. Clearly, she still felt rather emotional when she recalled the hard work back then. At that time, it was still a few 100 million years from 5-6 billion years ago, right? Luo Fan asked. That's right. The air hostess in the alternate timeline sighed and nodded, confirming Luo Fan's guess. In that case, the tides of the era were triggered before the time to erupt. I think it will manifest in another form. It's most likely to be with the help of some living being. If that's the case, your injuries, Luo Fan mumbled. Hearing this, the air hostess in the alternate timeline smiled bitterly and said, "You really guessed the answer so quickly." "That's right, the way the tides of the era erupted was exactly what you imagined. It summoned some kind of living being from the chaos and threw it into the Earth's universe, causing incomparably complete destruction to the entire universe. It kneaded the planets in the universe like sand, and rubbed space-time like a rag. The cultivators that I've cultivated for billions of years were like ants in front of it. They had no ability to resist at all, and were destroyed in droves. Even I was almost powerless in front of that living being. If it wasn't for the fact that the living being's intelligence wasn't high, giving me the opportunity to take advantage of it, perhaps I wouldn't be able to appear in front of you now." Chapter 1961. What happened next was obvious. Under the attack of the powerful creature, the Earth in the timeline kept collapsing and dying. Obviously, the empty lady in the timeline wouldn't sit back and watch this happen. Thus, he went up to stop it, to resist that powerful creature. And the final result, Luo Fan and the others had already seen it. That was, the empty lady in the timeline was seriously injured and could only come here to ask for help from Luo Fan. After listening to her, Luo Fan thought for a while, then sighed and said, "Let's go. Although I don't care about your timeline, I don't really care about it. Although I don't care about your timeline, the situation will be different if there's a creature from chaos." He didn't lie and say that he was worried about the empty lady in the timeline and the Earth in the timeline, so he decided to help. Instead, he told her the reason why he was going to help. After all, this reason couldn't be hidden at all. Even if the empty lady in the timeline was deceived for a while, she would definitely come to her senses soon. When that time came, it wouldn't be good. The empty lady in the timeline smiled bitterly when she heard Luo Fan's words. She naturally knew that Luo Fan wouldn't help her or the safety of the timeline. Once he decided to help, there must be a reason related to his own interests. Of course, she wasn't a literary young woman. For her, as long as the result was that Luo Fan was willing to help, it was fine. As for the specific reason, it didn't matter. Moreover, at least Luo Fan didn't lie to her. This made her feel more relieved. At that moment, she nodded and said, "Then what are we waiting for? Let's hurry up and go. Maybe that timeline has already been destroyed." Luo Fan just smiled. Then, from his body, another him slowly walked out of it. This was obviously his doppelganger. It seemed that he didn't intend to enter that timeline with his real body, but only his doppelganger. The reason for this was that the creature from chaos was too powerful. Even he didn't have absolute confidence that he could defeat it. Secondly, it was because that timeline was an extremely fragile timeline. Who knew when this timeline would completely collapse under the true sage's choice? Under such circumstances, he had no interest in dying along with that timeline. Fortunately, due to the special nature of Luo Fan's cultivation, the difference between his clone and his original body was not that great. His clone also possessed the power that his original body possessed. Therefore, using a clone to travel through time and space to that timeline didn't have much of an impact on the battle with the creature from the primal chaos. "You should also send a clone over." Luo Fan thought for a moment. He turned to Hun Ku and said, "As a matter of fact, even Space Maiden from a different timeline was so weak in front of the creature that came from the state of primal chaos." He didn't think that Hun Ku would be of any use if she went. Asking her to go over at this time was more for her to broaden her horizons. Since that was the case, it didn't matter if Hun Ku used her full strength or not. Hearing his words, Hun Ku was slightly stunned. Then, she nodded and also sent out a clone. Space Maiden from a different timeline saw this scene. She couldn't help but have a complicated expression. After all, the Earth universe in that timeline was her home. After all, she had a very close relationship with it. Under such circumstances, seeing how the others were so wary of their hometown, so much so that they weren't even willing to enter it personally, it was easy to imagine how uncomfortable it was for them to feel. However, at this time, she obviously couldn't say anything. After all, the two of them were completely helping her at this time. She couldn't possibly ask them to go into battle naked. What about you? Luo Fan turned to look at Space Maiden from a different timeline and asked. I won't use a clone. That's my home. Space Maiden from a different timeline said. Although she understood Luo Fan and the rest, she wouldn't agree that she was also wary of her own home. She couldn't use a clone to deal with the danger in her home. Hearing this, Hun Ku looked ashamed and said, Then I won't use a clone. I'll go in myself. Space Maiden from a different timeline shook her head and said, No, you can use a clone. Although you're my daughter, that's not your home. That's your home. You don't have to go in yourself. Moreover, you're the heavenly ruler of this world. This place needs you even more. These words made Hun Ku's expression change. Fortunately, she was a celestial Dharch after all. She held great authority in this world and possessed unimaginable wisdom, so she quickly figured out that what the Sky Lady said in an alternate timeline was not false. She sighed and said, All right, that's all we can do. Luo Fan didn't say anything to persuade Space Maiden from a different timeline. After all, she had already reached this level. What she should do and how she should choose to bear the danger was up to her own will. Since she was willing to bear this kind of danger, it was her own problem. At that moment, Luo Fan's doppelganger and Hun Ku's doppelganger, together with the real body of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline, started to activate the power of that strange power. Using a stone in the hand of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline as a medium, they started to practice the traces that the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline had left in the Earth's universe over the years. They started to activate the power and move towards the Earth's universe in the alternate timeline. In an instant, the figures of the three of them started to gradually blur on the platform. Boundless and powerful pressure appeared at the same time, acting on their bodies. They could feel their bodies starting to produce all sorts of cracking sounds, as if there were countless cracks appearing in their bodies, and they were constantly being smoothed out. Air Hostess from different timelines had already experienced such a situation several times. Luo Fan also had a similar experience. Only Hun Ku had encountered such an experience for the first time. For a moment, the expressions of Luo Fan and the empty lady from a different timeline were still quite relaxed, but their eyes were a little more serious. As for Hun Ku, her expression was constantly changing. The power in her body kept surging, resisting the powerful pressure with great difficulty. She tried hard to maintain her complete existence. The surrounding light and shadow kept changing. Countless worlds and worlds flashed before their eyes. In a trance, the three of them seemed to have passed through endless worlds, boundless space-time, and boundless chaos. In the process of their transmigration, time seemed to have no meaning for them. After an unknown period of time, an incomparably huge and incomparably powerful existence appeared in front of them, causing them to collide with it without any cover or protection. At this moment, the terrifying impact caused Hun Ku's doppelganger to tremble. In an instant, it collapsed and turned into smoke, almost completely disappearing. Fortunately, Luo Fan and Space Maiden from a different timeline were watching. At this moment, they acted at the same time. Waves of power shrouded Hun Ku's collapsing body. At this moment, it was like building blocks, and every single particle began to reassemble. In the blink of an eye, his body had already been completely constructed. The whole process did not even take any time. Hun Ku did not even feel the unimaginable pain before she had completely recovered. It could be said that if it wasn't for her astonishing memory and her unparalleled confidence in her senses, she might have suspected that the process of her body shattering was just an illusion that she had created at the moment of impact. When she came back to her senses, the three of them had already arrived in a boundless pitch-black void. At this moment, an extremely familiar yet inexplicable feeling welled up in Luo Fan's heart. In front of him was a boundless starry sky. It was the feeling that the Earth universe gave him. However, the feeling of the Earth universe was mixed with a kind of rune Tao. However, it was also mixed with a feeling of the rune path. This made it impossible for him to match it with the real Earth universe. It seems that we've arrived. Luo Fan sighed inexplicably. He had never thought that he would one day come to the Earth universe after the world had shattered. However, this was not the timeline that he was in, but another timeline. At this moment, an indescribably terrifying impact was transmitted from an extremely far place that transcended time and space. The entire Earth universe had a radius of trillions of light years. The source of the current fluctuation was in a location that was more than 3 billion light years away. However, the moment the fluctuation erupted, Luo Fan, who was here, had already sensed the existence of the fluctuation. And this was not because of Luo Fan's own outstanding perception ability, but because the fluctuations had really been transmitted from the source to this location over a distance of more than 3 billion light years. Not to mention anything else, a star that was tens of thousands of miles away had already been pushed away from its original trajectory due to the fluctuation. The way it operated was already quite different from before. Is it there? Luo Fan looked in the direction of the fluctuation and asked the empty maiden in the alternate timeline. Yes, it's there. There used to be a dojo that was opened by one of my disciples. It should have been destroyed by now, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline said in a low voice. In that case, not too much time has passed since you left and returned to the Earth universe? It should have only been a few dozen breaths. The empty maiden in the alternate timeline was stunned for a moment before she nodded. It was not difficult for any cultivator to calculate how much time had passed. Moreover, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline was an existence that had even surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm. If that's the case, then our appearance will definitely make that creature vigilant. It should find us very soon. Luo Fan just shook his head and said with a smile. Hearing this, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline came to a sudden realization. She nodded and said, "Yes, that's right. I was seriously injured when I was fighting with it, but I completely recovered after a few dozen breaths. Moreover, we appeared so far away from it, so it will definitely be vigilant." As expected, just as her voice fell, an incomparably powerful aura suddenly came crashing over from a faraway place. This aura. It wasn't the kind that would normally spread out and completely envelop the entire Earth and the universe. Instead, it was completely concentrated and turned into a scale that could only cover the three of them. Then, it completely crushed the three of them. At this moment, the surrounding lights and shadows changed. Countless heavens and realms suddenly appeared around them. In a trance, it was as if they had been removed from the Earth and the universe in an instant. It was as if they had been brazenly included in an extremely strange group of realms. The powerful pressure didn't just affect the three of them mentally, it also affected their bodies, impacting them and giving them an incomparably huge blow. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan and the empty maiden in the alternate timeline did not do anything. However, Hun Ku's aura had already been triggered. She began to erupt with a powerful Emperor Realm aura, which formed a fierce collision with the powerful aura around them. Boom, 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 a terrifying impact completely erupted at this moment. Under the impact of these two auras, the surrounding space-time was constantly collapsing and being destroyed. It was constantly collapsing and being destroyed. Terrifying shockwaves were constantly spreading in all directions. More and more realms formed by the auras kept collapsing and being destroyed. The scene was so tragic that it could not be described with words. At this moment, a loud roar was heard by the three of them. At this moment, this roar was only tens of thousands of miles away from them. Although this was still an extremely far distance for ordinary people, for existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others, it could be said to be completely face-to-face. Compared to the distance of billions of light years before, it was already a world of difference. As the confrontation of the surrounding auras continued, the countless realms. The scene of countless lights and shadows began to fade gradually. Everything seemed to have completely recovered at this moment. The scene of the boundless void reappeared once again. At this moment, Luo Fan finally saw clearly what that chaotic creature looked like. It was a long snake. It was a long snake that was covered in countless densely packed runes. It looked incomparably hideous, and its eyes were filled with endless ominous glints. Indistinctly, chaotic luster was constantly flowing in the depths of its eyes. It was several light years long, and its body proportion was not the slightest bit abnormal. It looked incomparably natural. Hence, it could be seen how shocking its size was. It could be said that, in terms of size, it was already very close to Luo Fan and the others, who were tens of thousands of miles away. Die, 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 die. After the huge creature appeared, incomparably terrifying sounds came from its mouth continuously. Its forked tongue kept drilling out from the center of its tightly shut mouth, causing the surrounding space to tremble and collapse continuously as its body squirmed slightly. The nomological laws and even the great Tao shook, producing all sorts of cracks and countless holes. It was an incomparably miserable scene in the void of the universe. It doesn't seem to have much intelligence. Luo Fan sighed. The creature itself was indeed incomparably powerful. In fact, it felt like it was many times stronger than him, who had already gone through 3 major tribulations and was about to face the 4th one. Facing it, even Luo Fan didn't have much confidence that he could resist it with just his strength alone. However, compared to its incomparably terrifying power, its intelligence was so insignificant. It felt like even an ordinary person could completely crush it in terms of intelligence. At this moment, the long snake suddenly opened its mouth, and a large amount of grayish chaotic airflow gushed out of its mouth, covering the sky and earth as it smashed towards Luo Fan. This mass of chaotic airflow was not truly chaotic, but it contained extremely strong chaotic characteristics. However, it contained extremely strong chaotic characteristics. As soon as it charged out of the snake's mouth, it had already crushed the surrounding spacetime, causing the great Tao of the Earth's universe to seem to have been completely broken and shattered. It could no longer produce any effect in this area. As for the chaotic air current itself, it continued to disintegrate and transform as it charged forward, splitting into countless time, space, matter, and energy. It squeezed into the shattered space and time around it in an incomparably explosive manner, pushing the already shattered laws and laws one step further into the chaotic abyss, causing the surrounding chaos to become even more unfathomable. At this moment, Luo Fan remained unfazed in the face of such a terrifying impact. With a thought, he grabbed Hun Ku and Space Maiden from an alternate timeline and took a step forward. A path of light extended from his feet, twisting and changing in the void, flashing and shuttling. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the chaotic airflow and arrived at the head of the long snake, appearing between its eyebrows. As soon as the path of light appeared, Luo Fan and the other 2 appeared at the end of the path of light at the same time. In other words, they appeared between the long snake's eyebrows. Chapter 1962. In any case, Luo Fan had already arrived at the spot between the primal chaos snake's eyebrows. The length of the chaos serpent must be measured in light years. Under such circumstances, even though the place where Luo Fan was at the center of the chaos serpent's eyebrows, from the perspective of ordinary living beings, he seemed to be boundless. In fact, those 2 protruding eyes were like 2 incomparably huge planets, overlooking everything on the earth from the extremely distant end of the world. There were countless runes on the body of this primordial chaos snake. It was completely similar to Space Maiden's Tao of runes in a different timeline. It was as if it had been abstracted from Space Maiden's Tao of runes and had undergone some mysterious changes. Such a situation in itself seemed to be extremely inconceivable, and it was sufficient to cause anyone to be unable to wrap their heads around it. However, with Luo Fan's deeper and deeper understanding of the state of chaos, He understood what was going on at a glance. The state of chaos itself was an existence that was fundamentally different from the world. In it, space-time dimensions, timelines, and different futures were all the same. In any world, in any timeline, in any space-time dimension, the state of primal chaos encountered was the same state of primal chaos. The reason why different timelines, different space-time dimensions, and even different futures had different manifestations of the chaos was because those manifestations were caused by the interaction between heaven and earth, space-time dimensions, the future, and the chaos. If this were to be placed in the timeline of the Earth universe, this primordial serpent in front of him seemed to have been born naturally in the state of primordial chaos. However, in reality, its appearance was completely formed by the interaction between the chaotic state and this timeline. In other words, it was because of the situation in the Earth's universe in this timeline that the chaos snake appeared. In this way, the primordial chaos serpent. Naturally, it had the characteristics of the Earth universe in this timeline. The Earth universe that had been transformed by Space Maiden in an alternate timeline was obviously the Earth universe that was dominated by the Path of Runes. Because of this, the primal chaos serpent was born. Naturally, there were traces of the Tao of runes on his body. Therefore, it was only natural for so many runes to appear on his body. All of this merely flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he put it aside. It didn't matter what the reason was. In any case, he had already confirmed that this Chaos Long Snake was his enemy. What he needed to do next was to defeat it. Apart from this, there was no other choice. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly raised his hand and pointed at the center of the snake's eyebrows. A mysterious power of the laws instantly surged out of his hand and condensed in the void. It directly transformed into a huge, sharp blade that copied and compressed all the concepts of sharpness in the universe. After that, it suddenly stabbed into the center of the snake's eyebrows. Kacha, 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 endless, terrifying explosions erupted from the point of contact between the sharp blade and the snakeskin armor. Endless shock waves were generated wave after wave, constantly spreading in all directions, like ripples formed by concentric circles, constantly surging in all directions. The Chaos Long Snake's armor was many times stronger than what Luo Fan had imagined. The sharp blade, which copied all the concepts of sharpness in the universe and was completely condensed by the power of the laws, did not produce any tangible results when facing the armor. Under the recoil of the armor, the sharp blade collapsed bit by bit. Instead, it crumbled bit by bit. Countless fragments of the sharp blades turned into smoke and scattered in all directions. They were taken away by the countless shock waves beneath this. There was only a white spot on the armor. There was only a white dot on the leather armor, and the white dot had completely disappeared when the shock wave brushed past it. The gap is actually so big? Luo Fan thought to himself in horror. At this moment, the countless runes on the surface of the Chaos Long Snake's body began to surge, turning into waves that pressed towards Luo Fan from all directions. This kind of momentum and terror was as if all the seawater in a perfect world had been compressed in an instant and was crushing towards him. In the face of such an impact, Luo Fan let out a loud roar. Endless law power swarmed out and began to penetrate into the endless waves around him. He began to guide the power of these waves with a purpose, causing the power of these waves to gradually change direction under his guidance. From the original target of Luo Fan, it brazenly changed to the center of Luo Fan's eyebrows. Although it was called a wave, it was actually endless runes. These runes were more mysterious and complicated than the runes of the Great Path. It could be said that if any rune was thrown into a world without any cultivators, it would be enough to cause an earth-shattering change in that world. It would cause a cultivation civilization to be born from nothing, and it might even be able to nurture powerful cultivators who had reached the false sage stage. The terrifying power of such a rune was self-evident. Just like that, they covered the heavens and the earth, and countless trillions of them were densely packed together. It was obvious how shocking the effect would be. Under the impact of the runes, the space between the eyebrows of the primal chaos snake, which was enscathed by Luo Fan's sharp blade, suddenly trembled. The leather armor seemed to have been eroded by the wind and began to collapse. In the blink of an eye, the flesh and blood inside were completely exposed. Although the chaos long snake lacked intelligence, it still had instincts after all. Seeing that its own power had caused so much damage to itself, its movements immediately paused. The countless runes that were about to continue drilling into its flesh and continue to destroy its flesh and even endanger its life suddenly stopped. As they collapsed, they continuously scattered and gradually turned back into the original runes that covered its body again. Of course, these were the results of the runes that were still under the control of the Chaos Long Snake. One had to know that the means that Luo Fan had used just now were not illusions. Although those runes were the power of the Chaos Long Snake itself, under Luo Fan's full control, there were finally some runes. They had truly broken free from the other party's control and were now under his control. Therefore, although most of the runes had already collapsed and returned to their original positions, there were still a large number of runes that were like a long river under Luo Fan's control. It continued to drill into the broken leather armor, continuously destroying the flesh and blood of the long snake. At this moment, the long snake let out an incomparably mournful scream. As it screamed, its body kept churning, constantly shattering the surrounding space. As for the many nearby stars, they were inevitably turned into nothingness. Such a scene made Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, feel heartache and helpless. She could only continuously move some planets with living beings away and place them in a safe place. However, this was only a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. The Chaos Serpent was so huge that it collided with too many stars in a single roll. Its rolling speed was so fast that even though Space Maiden from an alternate timeline was so powerful, she could only move a small number of stars away in a short period of time. For most of the planets, however, he could only watch helplessly as the primal chaos snake crushed him. So powerful! I didn't expect there to be such a creature. Hun Ku was extremely shocked by the power of the Chaos Long Snake while helping Space Maiden in a different timeline. Although she was already a celestial Dharch of a world and her cultivation realm had reached a level that was close to surpassing the Supreme Emperor realm, she had never seen such a terrifying creature before. However, she had never seen such a terrifying creature. She could sense that the creature in front of her was at least tens of millions of times stronger than her. If she were to fight it, not to mention the clone in front of her, even if her main body was in that world and had absolute control over it, she would not be able to gain any advantage. In fact, she might not even be able to get close to it. Before this, she had never imagined that such a powerful creature would actually exist in this world. At this moment, she suddenly felt glad that she had insisted on coming here with her mother. At this moment, Luo Fan did not feel good either. Although he was using the runes on the Chaos Long Snake's body to continuously hurt it, this did not mean that he was not consuming his own power. On the contrary, every time he manipulated the runes, his law power would be consumed several times. Every rune was struggling frantically in his hands. They were trying their best to return to their owner's control and merge with the endless runes. This required him to use all his power to suppress and influence the runes. Once he relaxed even a little, the endless runes would return to the Chaos Long Snake's body. While he was exhausting his law power, he had to endure the Chaos Long Snake's intense struggle and the terrifying impact that the Chaos Long Snake had set up to shatter time and space and completely shatter the nomological laws. It went without saying how it felt. It could be said that he no longer had any spare energy to pay attention to the outside world. He could only wholeheartedly manipulate the runes to penetrate the Chaos Long Snake's head and do everything possible to destroy the insides of its body. That primal Chaos Serpent was simply too huge. Its scalp was hundreds of millions of miles long. Even though the power he was manipulating was extremely powerful, it would still take a long time for Luo Fan to break through its scalp and injure its internal organs. The Chaos Long Snake kept thrashing about, trying its best to alleviate the pain caused by the hole in its forehead. At the same time, it instinctively began to manipulate the endless power to gather at its forehead and quickly break through its wound. It appeared in front of the huge pit and pounced towards Luo Fan in an overwhelming manner. Although this was only power, it contained boundless vitality and endless battle instincts. It was like many living creatures had formed an army and were charging towards Luo Fan in a frenzy. The light figures formed by these powers were all in the shape of humans. Some were tall, some were short, some were fat, and some were thin. Some were extremely large, while others were extremely small. The many living creatures gathered together seemed to form countless torrents. The momentum was so huge that it was truly earth-shattering. In such a situation, how could Luo Fan not sense it? At that moment, he focused his mind with great difficulty and separated himself from manipulating the runes and resisting the changes in time and space around him. He then looked towards the endless power. The number of living creatures formed by these powers was extremely high. Just a glance was enough to tell that there were at least trillions of them. There were so many living creatures. Although their intelligence wasn't that great, their combat instincts were extremely strong. As they pounced over, they instinctively chose the most rigorous and perfect method. As they converged, the surrounding time and space were constantly changing like plasticine under their control. They turned into all sorts of indescribably terrifying powers that recreated time and space, worlds, and lands. Faced with such an attack, Luo Fan let out a long sigh of relief. The attack seemed extremely powerful and could destroy all cultivators and all powerhouses. However, in his eyes, compared to the attack of the Chaos Long Snake that directly spat out the chaos air, it was much easier to deal with. There was no other reason for this. Even though there were many living beings formed from the countless powers in front of him, and they were also quite powerful, they did not have much intelligence, which was enough for him to easily steal their powers and use them to attack other living beings. In this way, the more living creatures there were, the more advantageous it would be for him. Moreover, although these living creatures were powerful, they were only equivalent to ordinary cultivators. However, that was only equivalent to an ordinary cultivator. To him, a single slap from him was enough to kill tens of thousands of these living beings. Due to these various reasons, it was naturally relatively easy for him to deal with these living creatures. The truth was just as he had expected. Luo Fan had easily grasped the weaknesses of these creatures. He did not even need to make many moves to seize more than half of the creature's power. With a turn of the direction, he diverted the countless attacks in another direction and threw them at the remaining living creatures. An earth-shattering explosion occurred at this moment. The countless living creatures collapsed under the impact and turned back into power. They began to shatter bit by bit and finally collapsed completely. Before he knew it, they had already disappeared without a trace. However, before Luo Fan could heave a sigh of relief, even more living creatures were born and continued to pounce at him from all directions, as expected of living creatures without much intelligence. They clearly know that this kind of attack is ineffective, but they still want to continue. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, but his movements didn't slow down in the slightest. He continued to manipulate the power of those creatures like before, and with a turn, he once again went towards other creatures, and once again exterminated them. Just as Luo Fan had expected, the same attack appeared again after that. The scene was just like the previous one. They were destroyed once again. Just like that, one cycle after another, reincarnation after reincarnation continued in the deep pit between his brows. When Luo Fan had already penetrated tens of thousands of miles with the sharp blade formed by the runes and arrived before the long snake's skull, the cycle had already continued for hundreds of millions of times. To Luo Fan, each cycle was just a matter of a few thoughts and actions. It seemed extremely simple. However, as the cycle continued, his expression gradually changed. From the initial relaxed and disdainful look, it gradually turned solemn. There was no other reason. It was because he realized that every time those living creatures were destroyed, there would be some extremely subtle changes when they were born again. This kind of change was so insignificant that even he would overlook it if he didn't pay close attention. However, as the changes continued to accumulate, after hundreds of millions of times, the changes had accumulated to a point that no one could ignore them anymore. Up until now, although Luo Fan was still able to destroy those creatures, the amount of energy he needed to do so was more than twice as much as before. This was naturally not a big deal if it was under normal circumstances. But in this situation where his energy to deal with these living beings was completely derived from squeezing out his own mind, he was gradually beginning to feel pressured. The skull was something that was even harder than the leather armor on the surface. Compared to the leather armor, it was much more difficult to penetrate the skull. Even with the runes that came with the Chaos Snake, Luo Fan's speed had suddenly slowed down by thousands of times. If he was said to be riding a rocket previously, his speed now was like taking a stroll. This difference caused the number of attacks he encountered to soar by more than 10 times as compared to before. He could predict that the number of attacks he had to encounter from here to penetrate the Chaos Snake's skull would definitely be more than 10 times as compared to before. According to the increase in the number of attacks, it was obvious that things would not go so smoothly. Although it doesn't have much intelligence, I didn't expect its combat instinct to be able to adjust and improve its attacks at any time. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became increasingly solemn.